there exists a liquid secret that ancient civilizations guarded. Water remembers. That ocean you carry within has been the silent witness to every one of your wounds and victories. This is not a metaphor. It is your constitutive reality. This book teaches you how to cleanse that ancestral record and transform your pain into a driving force for creation. Whoever comprehends the code of the spring ceases seeking external solutions, becoming instead the inexhaustible source of their own destiny. Your transformation begins in the depths of your own waters. Chapter 1. The Anatomy of the Fluid Being. There is a lie that modern civilization has perfected with clinical mastery. A lie so ancient and so deeply ingrained in the structure of collective thought that it is no longer perceived as a lie, but as self-evident truth, as the firm ground upon which everything else rests. It is the lie of solidity. From the moment you are born, and the world begins its work of naming you, classifying you, and assigning you a place within its architecture of fixed categories, the conspiracy of solidity is already underway. You are given a name, a family history, a set of inherited characteristics, and a series of biological limitations that supposedly define the immutable perimeter of what you can become. Formal education doesn't interrupt this conspiracy. It reinforces it with each passing year, with each assessment that tells you what you can and can't achieve, with each institutional narrative that presents the world as a set of fixed structures that the individual must learn to navigate, not transform. They teach you dates, formulas, and standard adaptation procedures, but they never teach you the most radical and liberating truth about your own nature, that you are, in essence, a being of fluids in perpetual motion, a liquid architecture of distributed intelligence that can be purified, elevated, and reprogrammed at will. Stop for a moment and consider the facts that elementary biology never presented to you with the gravity they deserve. Your body is, for the most part, water. Not a modest or anecdotal percentage, but a proportion that should completely reshape how you perceive yourself. Approximately 2/3 of everything you are, every cell, every tissue, every organ that keeps you alive at this very moment, is made up of water. Academia presented this fact to you as an inert curiosity, a footnote to basic biochemistry. But what no one told you with enough emphasis, with the urgency this fact warrants, is that this water is not a passive filler, a maintenance lubricant like oil in an engine. It is the active medium where your entire inner reality unfolds. It is the substance through which your thoughts become biochemistry. Your biochemistry becomes behavioral patterns, and your behavioral patterns become the texture of the reality you experience every day. The science of biological water has begun to reveal, with a precision that shakes the foundations of the materialist paradigm, that water molecules within a living organism do not behave like ordinary water. Biological water forms dynamic crystalline architectures, organizing itself into layers and geometries that respond to electromagnetic stimuli, temperature variations, mechanical pressures, and, in ways that conventional science still cautiously studies, to the internal states of consciousness that inhabit them. Physicist Gerald Pollack, in his research on what he calls the fourth state of water, has documented that water in contact with biological surfaces forms an exclusion zone with properties radically different from water in free volume. This structured water acts as a medium for storing and transmitting information, challenging the description that standard chemistry offers of this element. To truly understand why you are a fluid being and not a solid object, you need to descend from the cellular level to the molecular level. At that scale, the water molecule reveals its extraordinary nature. 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom are bonded at a precise geometric angle that generates a permanent electrical polarity. One end of the molecule carries a slightly negative charge, and the other end carries a slightly positive charge. This asymmetry, which in a superficial description seems like a minor technical detail, has consequences of extraordinary magnitude. It transforms each water molecule into an electric dipole, a microscopic antenna capable of orienting and reorienting itself in response to both external and internal electromagnetic fields. When millions of these microscopic antennae coexist within a living organism, they do not act in isolation or chaotically. They organize themselves into dynamic networks in what researchers have called coherence domains, regions where the movement of molecules synchronizes as if responding to an invisible score that the entire network interprets simultaneously. In these coherent domains, water acquires properties it cannot exhibit in a disordered state. The ability to store and transfer information, to maintain structural patterns over time, and to act as an ultra-fast communication medium between different parts of the organism. A processing speed that far exceeds the speed of conventional nerve impulses. This is the true anatomy of the fluid being that you are. Not a machine of gears and levers that operates through isolated, point-like electrochemical impulses, but a liquid network of distributed intelligence, where information circulates through patterns of molecular organization that connect what you think with what you feel with what you manifest in the biochemistry of your blood, and what happens in your biochemistry with the quality of reality you experience moment by moment. Human beings who still operate from the paradigm of solidity make the fundamental mistake of trying to change their lives by acting solely on external structures, on visible circumstances. They change jobs but carry with them the same polluted inner ocean. They end one relationship and begin another, but the pattern of their emotions reproduces the same messages of inadequacy. They move to a new city, but their biological water networks continue to transmit the same frequencies of fear that generated the original problems. The outward form changes. The internal code remains intact. And so, the cycle repeats itself with a fidelity that would be admirable if it weren't so painful. The conscious fluid being, in contrast, understands that all lasting transformation begins at the water level. Not at the level of external circumstances, but at the level of the medium that records, amplifies, and projects the information from its inner world into three-dimensional reality. When this being intervenes with its fluids, when it consciously works with the quality of information it allows to be recorded in its biology, it produces changes that don't require a titanic effort against the current. It produces changes that flow naturally because it has modified the source code before reality is compiled. This understanding is not abstract, nor is it reserved for spiritual initiates with decades of contemplative practice. It is a practical, immediate, and applicable reorientation that begins with a gesture as simple as changing the question you ask yourself each morning. Instead of asking what I must do today to force the results I need, the fluid being learns to ask what internal state I need to be in today so that the results flow to me without resistance. The first question operates from the logic of the solid. The second operates from the intelligence of the fluid. And the difference between the two is not semantic. It is the difference between a life of exhausting effort with inconsistent results and a life of creative flow where transformation occurs with the naturalness of a river finding its way to the sea. The first practice of being fluid is the solemn recognition of your own aquatic nature, not as a poetic metaphor, but as an operational fact that should guide every daily decision. Beginning the day with this recognition, with this moment of conscious contact with the inner ocean you inhabit, is the first act of sovereignty over your biological field. It is the inaugural movement of the healing that this book will guide you to build, layer upon layer, chapter by chapter, until the fluid being you already are, by nature, becomes the conscious fluid being you can choose to be in every moment. For the next 7 days, dedicate 5 minutes each morning, before consulting any devices, to what we will call the inner ocean recognition. Sit with your spine straight, close your eyes, and place one hand on your chest and the other on your abdomen. Breathe slowly 3 times, allowing your belly to expand with each inhalation. As you do this, bring your attention to the fluid sensation within you, the warmth, the subtle movement, the presence of water in your tissues. You don't need to visualize anything elaborate. Simply perceive that you are more fluid than solid, more movement than fixed structure. Observe, without judgment, what sensations, memories, or emotions arise during this exercise. Write them down in a notebook dedicated solely to this work. These emerging experiences are the first map of your inner ocean. In what areas of your life have you behaved more like a rock than water? What rigid structures in your thinking, relationships, or daily routine might be preventing healing from flowing naturally to you right now? By now, you know this isn't just a simple video. If you want to delve even deeper, click the first link in the description. Chapter 2. The Corrupt File. How Pain Takes Root. No human being consciously chooses to carry the burden of pain. In no moment of genuine lucidity and freedom does anyone decide to install a file of suffering in their inner system, which they will then compulsively reproduce for decades with an incomprehensible loyalty to everything that causes them harm. And yet, the pain takes root. It takes root with a disturbing efficiency, with a capacity for entrenchment that defies all voluntary efforts to eradicate it. To heal from the source, before learning any purification technique, before adopting any frequency-raising practice, you need to understand precisely the mechanism by which pain becomes a permanent file in your inner field. You need to know the anatomy of the installation. The process begins long before you are able to consciously recall it, during a period of life that developmental neuroscience describes as characterized by unprecedented receptive openness. The infant's brain operates in low-frequency states, dominated by delta and theta waves, the same states that in adults correspond to deep sleep or hypnosis. This means that the young child processes the world in a state that could be compared to that of a tape recorder without active filters. The critical capacity that acts as a selective guardian of incoming information in adults is not yet present. Everything that occurs in the environment, the words of parents, the emotional tones of everyday interactions, the atmospheres of tension or love that permeate the home, is registered directly in the nervous system without mediation, without analysis, without the possibility of separating what is objective truth from what is merely the projected pain of the adults surrounding the child. When an experience occurs in that primary environment that exceeds the processing capacity of the infant nervous system, whether it be a traumatic separation, some form of physical or emotional violence, repeated absence of necessary affection, or constant exposure to an environment of chronic tension and emotional chaos, the organism executes an emergency protocol that is, at the time, the most intelligent response available. It cannot process the experience in real time. It cannot integrate it into a coherent narrative that transforms it into assimilated learning. So it does the only thing it can do with the available resources. It encapsulates it. It freezes it in a structure of muscular tension, visceral contraction, and altered patterns of bodily fluid flow, storing it in the tissue until the system has sufficient capacity and security to fully process it. That moment, in most cases, never arrives spontaneously. The file remains stored indefinitely. And this is where understanding the fluid nature of your being becomes clinically crucial. A pain file stored in the body is not an inert file. It's not a closed box resting in a corner without affecting anything. It's a file that continues running in the background, consuming system resources, generating error messages that manifest as chronic physical symptoms, as relational patterns that repeat with agonizing consistency, as inexplicable limitations in the capacity to receive love, abundance, or recognition, even when the environment offers them. The water in your body is the medium where this archive is stored and from where it operates. With a fidelity that simultaneously inspires awe and urgency, your bodily fluids hold the biochemical information of each activation of the pain pattern. Every time a present situation triggers the archive stored in the past, the neuropeptides corresponding to the original emotional state flood the bloodstream. The water in your cells receives this information and records it. Over time, if this activation is frequent enough, the water in your body develops what we might call a working memory of those states. It becomes, in operational terms, so familiar with them that when those frequencies are absent, the system misses them and generates situations that restore them. This is why unconscious self-sabotage is not a psychological mystery. It is a biological response from a system that seeks to maintain coherence with its own stored patterns. This is why purely cognitive healing, the simple act of intellectually understanding the origin of your pain, rarely produces lasting transformation. You can spend years developing a coherent and accurate narrative about why you are the way you are, clearly identifying the events that instilled your pain patterns, and yet wake up every morning with the same weight, the same contraction, the same inexplicable distance between what you know you deserve and what you are able to allow yourself to receive. Intellectual understanding works at the level of conscious thought. But the pain file doesn't reside in conscious thought. It lives in the water. It lives in the tissues. It lives in the autonomic nervous system, which operates below the threshold of ordinary awareness, governing your reality from an engine room to which the intellect has only limited access. To heal the installed pattern at its source, intervention must occur at the level where it is stored. This doesn't mean that intellectual work and personal narrative are useless. It means they are insufficient on their own. They need to be accompanied by interventions that speak directly to the fluid body. Conscious movement, directed breathing, somatic contact, intentional temperature variations, precisely applied sound, and above all, the deep, sustained silence that allows the nervous system to emerge from the chronic state of emergency in which it has been operating for years or even decades. There is a distinction that marks the difference between perpetual struggle with pain and the genuine process of healing. The corrupted file is not your enemy. At the moment it was installed, it was an act of survival by your nervous system. It was the most intelligent response possible from an organism that lacked the resources to process what was happening to it. To condemn that file is to condemn the being who made that emergency decision to stay safe. The correct attitude toward the pain file is not war. It is technical compassion, clearly seeing its original function, thanking it for the service it provided when it was needed, and proceeding methodically and patiently to dissolve the information that no longer serves the being you are today. Find a quiet, private moment of at least 15 minutes, free from interruptions. Take a piece of paper and write for 10 minutes without censorship, answering this question. What story about myself have I been repeating my whole life, even when that story hurts me? Don't look for an elaborate or philosophical answer. Write down the first thing that comes to mind, even if it seems obvious, painful, or shameful. That first unfiltered outpouring is the map of your core issues. Then close your eyes, bring your attention to the center of your chest, and observe, without trying to change anything, the bodily sensations that this story creates. You're not here to solve anything yet. You're here to explore the territory. And accurate knowledge of the territory is always the first true act of healing. What pattern of pain has repeated itself in your life consistently enough that you no longer question it? What part of that pattern might be the sign of a file installed before you had the words to name it? Chapter 3. The first law of the spring. Everything flows or rots. The pre-Socratic Greeks, in their wisdom, stripped of the technological trappings we now mistake for progress, had already grasped the principle that molecular biology is rediscovering with precision instruments. Everything that doesn't flow rots. Heraclitus condensed the most fundamental law of living existence into an image of perfect poetic economy. You cannot step into the same river twice, because neither the river nor you are the same. Movement is not an accident of matter. It is its intrinsic condition. It is the primordial evidence that something is alive. This first law of the spring is not a philosophical metaphor to be contemplated with intellectual satisfaction from the safe distance of beautiful concepts. It is an operational law that governs every living system with the same implacability with which gravity governs physical bodies. And its application to the healing process is so direct, so immediate, and so capable of reorganizing life that understanding it deeply can, in itself, be the beginning of a transformation that no subsequent technique could achieve without this foundation. To understand what this law means, in concrete terms for your healing process, first observe what water itself teaches you when you watch it closely. A mountain stream flowing energetically over its stone bed is a permanent and spontaneous purification system. The movement itself generates constant oxygenation, dissolves waste as it forms, prevents sediment buildup, and maintains the conditions that allow life in all its diversity and fullness. That same stream, if it is stopped, if a dam is built, that turns it into a stagnant pool, begins to accumulate precisely what the movement dissolved. Organic particles are deposited in increasing layers. Anaerobic bacteria, those that thrive in the absence of oxygen, begin to multiply with an efficiency that transforms the environment. The water that was once crystal clear and vital gradually becomes a medium of increasing opacity, with an altered chemical composition, which can no longer sustain the same diversity of life that the moving water naturally supported. Your emotional system operates under the exact same law, with the same precision and the same lack of exceptions. Emotions are energy in motion. This statement, which circulates in personal development circles, is not a comforting phrase designed to make the reader feel good. It is a functional description of what emotions are at a neurophysiological level. An emotion is an integrated response of the organism, a coordinated pattern of neurological activation, hormonal changes, variations in heart and respiratory rate, modulation of muscle tone, and alterations in the flow of bodily fluids, all synchronized to prepare the organism to respond effectively to an environmental situation. When emotion serves its purpose, when the response it generates is executed and the system fully processes it, emotional energy is transformed and flows into the next configuration. Anger, expressed appropriately, becomes clarity about boundaries and direct action. Fear, faced with conscious presence, becomes accumulated courage and valuable information about what needs attention. Pain, cried out without resistance, or shame becomes an expanded capacity to feel more deeply and to connect with the experiences of others. Emotion flows, and as it flows, it transforms without leaving any residue in the system. But when emotion cannot flow, when the environment is unsafe for its expression, or when the individual suppresses it for fear of what it might reveal, emotional energy doesn't simply disappear because it isn't released. Energy isn't destroyed, it's stored. In the case of systematically suppressed emotions, this energy is deposited in the body with the same physical literalness with which stagnant water accumulates sediment. It settles as patterns of chronic tension in muscle tissue, developing a rigidity that no amount of targeted massage can permanently resolve. It's encoded in bodily fluids as a constant state of alert, keeping the autonomic nervous system in a state of activation that no longer corresponds to any real threat in the present, but rather to the amplified echo of past threats that were never fully processed. The individual who has spent decades accumulating unprocessed emotions experiences a phenomenon that from the outside is sometimes described as existential heaviness or apathy, but which, from within, is felt as the visceral certainty that there is an invisible ceiling on their capacity to fully rejoice, to love without reservation, to create freely, and to receive without guilt. This ceiling is not a product of the imagination. It is real and has a physical location. It is the accumulated pressure of an emotional system that has been operating like a stagnant pond for far too long. The first law of the spring also operates at the level of thoughts and beliefs. A thought that circulates freely, that is examined with curiosity, that is honestly questioned, and that is allowed to evolve as experience enriches it, is a living thought that contributes to the adaptive intelligence of the system. A belief that is compulsively repeated, that has frozen in a fixed form because questioning it would threaten the stability of an identity built upon it, is a stagnant belief. And a system full of stagnant beliefs, of certainties that ceased to be questioned so long ago that they are now mistaken for objective reality, is a system that progressively becomes impoverished, that loses the capacity to learn, to be surprised, and to adapt to the demands of a reality that never stops moving. To consciously activate the first law of the spring within your own system, the first step requires no dramatic or painful gestures. It requires only the honest recognition of where the flow is stagnant. What conversation have you been putting off for years because you believe its consequences would be too disruptive? What decision have you been spiraling around for months without taking any real steps, feeding the illusion that thinking about it more is the same as acting? What emotion have you been suppressing for so long that you can barely remember what it felt like to experience it freely? Each of these questions points precisely to a place where the water of your life has stopped flowing. And stagnant water, without exception, begins its process of transformation toward opacity. The invitation in this chapter is not to force a major disruptive movement. The spring doesn't demand avalanches. The spring demands the consistency of flow, the continuous movement, however small, the constant dripping that, with patience and persistence, eventually carves a path through the hardest rock. The movement that breaks the stagnation can be as simple as finally having that pending conversation, as making a decision that has been postponed for too long. as allowing oneself to cry over what has been bottled up for too long behind the armor of permanent composure. Take your notebook and make a list of 3 to 5 areas in your life where you feel the flow has stopped. These could be relationships, projects, emotions, decisions, or aspects of your health. For each one, write an honest answer to these 2 questions. What would begin to move if I took just one step, however small, in this direction? What specific fear has been responsible for keeping this stalled? You don't need to act on these answers immediately, but the act of precisely naming the points of stagnation already introduces movement into the system. Clear awareness is itself a current. What has a part of you gained by keeping certain flows stopped? What is the hidden benefit of the stagnation you've been protecting without being fully aware of it? Chapter 4. The Inner Laboratory. Your body as an instrument of healing. There is a fundamental difference between a patient and a researcher. The patient expects something external, a substance, a procedure, an intervention authorized by someone with credentials to correct what is wrong within them. The researcher, on the other hand, works with what they have, rigorously observes the results of their interventions, and adjusts their method based on the data the system itself provides. The transformation from patient to researcher of your own biological field is one of the most powerful moves you can make on the path to healing. And for that move, you need to understand something that conventional medicine rarely teaches with sufficient clarity. Your body is not a passive recipient of external treatments. It is the most sophisticated healing laboratory in existence, equipped with a self-regulating capacity that surpasses any available medical technology in complexity. The body's intelligence as a healing system is not a new idea, nor does it belong exclusively to spiritual traditions. Modern biology has rigorously documented the organism's capacity to detect anomalies, deploy immune responses with astonishing precision, regenerate damaged tissues, and restore homeostatic balance after disturbances of enormous magnitude. What is generally not emphasized enough is that this healing intelligence does not operate independently of the internal state of the being inhabiting the body. It operates in constant dialogue with it. The state of the body's fluids, the quality of the information circulating through the autonomic nervous system, the level of coherence between heart rate and breathing patterns, all of these directly and quantifiably modulate the efficiency of the body's natural healing systems. Psychoneuroimmunology, a field of research that studies the relationship between psychological states and immune system function, has accumulated sufficient evidence in recent decades to state beyond a reasonable doubt that what you think and feel has measurable and clinically significant biological consequences. Natural killer cells of the immune system, responsible for identifying and eliminating damaged or infected cells, show variations in their activity that correlate with documented emotional states. Inflammatory mediators, molecules that regulate the body's inflammatory response, are modulated by the state of coherence or incoherence of the autonomic nervous system. Even gene expression, the level at which instructions in the genetic code are activated or silenced, responds to stimuli from the internal environment, including states of chronic stress or sustained well-being. In practical and immediate terms, this means that every time you consciously choose to modify your internal state, every time you introduce a practice that raises the coherence of your nervous system, reduces the cortisol and adrenaline levels in your fluids, and allows the water in your biology to organize itself into patterns of greater order and harmony. You are literally changing the conditions of the laboratory in which your body works. You are creating a biological environment that fosters healing in ways that transcend what any single external intervention can achieve in a sustained manner. The body's internal laboratory works with 4 main instruments that the conscious being can learn to operate with increasing mastery. The first is breathing, not the automatic, unconscious breathing that the body performs without your participation 24 hours a day, but deliberate breathing, directed with intention towards specific physiological goals. Breathing is the only process of the autonomic nervous system that can be taken under immediate and direct conscious control. This makes it the quickest and most readily available lever for accessing the body's internal regulatory processes. Consciously changing the rate, depth, and pattern of breathing for just a few minutes produces measurable changes in heart rate variability, blood carbon dioxide levels, the relative activation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and the chemical composition of the fluids circulating throughout the body. The second tool is conscious movement. Unlike conventional physical exercise, whose primary focus is performance or modifying body composition, conscious movement is oriented toward perceiving the body from within during movement. It involves paying full attention to the sensations that emerge when the body moves, exploring its limits and spaces of freedom, and finding in physical movement a way to engage in dialogue with the patterns of tension, blockage, and fluidity that the body holds. Disciplines such as yoga, somatic movement, biodanza, or simply dancing without an audience share the characteristic of inviting the practitioner to inhabit the body from within while moving, rather than observing it from the outside as an object to be trained. The third instrument is silence. In a world designed to keep attention perpetually activated, genuine silence, both external and internal, has become so scarce that many people experience acute discomfort when confronted with it. This discomfort is itself valuable information. It is the signal of a nervous system that has been operating in a state of continuous stimulation for so long that it no longer knows how to function without it. Silence is not the absence of activity. It is the state in which the nervous system can finally stop processing the onslaught of external information and begin processing the vast territory of internal information it has accumulated. It is in silence that the body reveals what it has been holding on to, where the pain files stored in the iron fluids begin to show their edges, where the organism's healing intelligence can work without the constant interference of external noise. The fourth tool is interoceptive awareness, the ability to perceive sensations occurring within the body. Neuroscience research has documented that interoceptive awareness, the ability to accurately perceive what is happening inside the body, is directly related to the capacity to regulate emotions, make decisions aligned with one's true needs, and navigate stress without being overwhelmed by it. Cultivating interoceptive awareness means cultivating the ability to read the laboratory, to interpret the data the body constantly offers as signals of its state, its needs, and its healing process. This week, choose a 15-minute time each day for what we'll call the lab round. Sit or lie down in a comfortable position and close your eyes. Begin with 3 slow, deep breaths. Then, take a systematic scan of your body, starting at your feet and gradually moving up to your head. In each area, pause for a few seconds and simply observe what is present: tension, heat, cold, pulsation, emptiness, pain, lightness. Don't try to change anything. Just notice. At the end of the scan, write down in your notebook the 3 areas where the sensation was most intense, whether from pain, tension, or a feeling of blockage. These are the points where the lab is sending you priority signals. What part of your body has been asking for your attention for the longest time, and you've been ignoring it? What might that area be holding on to that you haven't been willing to listen to yet? Chapter 5. Erase without destroying. The art of conscious purge. There is an understandable, almost universal temptation on the path to healing, the temptation of total erasure. When someone becomes aware of the weight of the patterns they have been carrying, when they can finally see clearly the files of pain that have been governing their life from the shadows of the unconscious, the immediate response is often the impulse to eliminate them as quickly and radically as possible, to wipe the slate clean, to start from scratch. This impulse is understandable and, to a certain extent, virtuous, insofar as it stems from a genuine desire for freedom. But applied without the understanding offered in this chapter, it can transform the healing process into a war against oneself that causes more harm than it seeks to repair. To erase without destroying is the art of conscious purging. It is the difference between a surgeon who precisely removes damaged tissue while preserving surrounding systems and someone who attempts to solve the same problem with tools designed to demolish entire structures. The former heals. The latter leaves the patient in worse condition than before the intervention. The distinction lies not in the strength of the intention to heal, but in the understanding of the nature of the system being operated on. To understand why unconscious purging, the attempt to erase pain patterns through forced suppression, positive thinking applied as a denial of what exists, or the accelerated flight from everything that triggers them, produces such inconsistent and often counterproductive results. It is necessary to return to the nature of the pain files stored in the fluid body. These files are not merely abstract information stored at some ethereal level of being. They are encoded in concrete molecular patterns, in the configuration of biological water networks, in tissue tension patterns, and in the activation thresholds of the autonomic nervous system. Attempting to erase them through conscious willpower is like trying to reformat a hard drive using only the power of thought. The intention is correct. The level of intervention is incorrect. Conscious purging begins with an understanding that seems paradoxical at first, but which, with practice, reveals its precision. To dissolve a pattern of pain, you must first allow it to be fully present, not with the intention of endlessly reproducing it, not with the attitude of identifying with it as if it were a definitive truth about who you are, but with the willingness to observe it with clean, non-judgmental attention, to give it the space it needs to fully reveal itself. This act of being fully present with what is, without trying to change it, without running away from it, without adding layers of interpretation and judgment that increase its density, activates an integration process in the nervous system that no suppression technique can replicate. The neuroscience of trauma has documented a process called memory reconsolidation, which describes the mechanism by which a stored memory can be modified when activated in a safe context. Whenever a memory, whether explicit or implicit, stored in the conscious memory system or in the body's sensory and emotional patterns, is reactivated, it temporarily enters a state of plasticity where it can be modified by new information and a new context present at the time of reactivation. If the reactivation context is one of safety, with the presence and absence of the original danger, the nervous system can update the stored information, reducing the intensity of the alarm response that the memory triggered. This mechanism is the neurobiological basis of the art of erasing without destroying. Conscious purging doesn't attempt to forcibly eliminate painful memories. It deliberately activates them in a safe environment, holds them with presence and compassion while the nervous system processes the information they contain and allows the natural updating process to occur. The memory doesn't disappear in the sense that the experience that generated it ceases to exist, but its power to trigger emergency responses gradually diminishes until what was once a wound that bled at the slightest touch becomes a scar. The visible evidence of something that was difficult and has been overcome, something that no longer has the power to dictate the present. The three conditions that make conscious purging possible are safety, presence, and appropriate pacing. Safety means that the process must occur in a context, internal, and when necessary, external as well, where the nervous system can perceive that it is not in real danger. Presence means that the practitioner is fully attentive, neither dissociated nor on autopilot, but genuinely in touch with what emerges. And appropriate pacing means that exposure to the pain files is dosed in such a way that the system can integrate what emerges without being overwhelmed by it, respecting the individual window of tolerance that varies from person to person and from moment to moment. Choose one of the pain patterns you identified in the previous chapters, preferably one of medium intensity, neither the most superficial nor the deepest. Dedicate 10 minutes to the following practice. Sit with your spine straight, close your eyes, and allow that pattern to emerge into your awareness. Don't actively seek it out. Simply open the space and observe what arises. When you feel it present, both in thought and bodily sensation, gently place one hand on the area of your body where the sensation is most intense. Keep your hand there with light, warm pressure. Do nothing but be present with what is, without trying to change it, without judging it. Remain like this for 5 minutes. Then write in your journal what happened, what changed, or what remained the same during that time of presence. What is the difference between being aware of a pain pattern and being consumed by it? What kind of attention does pain need to move, as opposed to the kind of attention that keeps it fixed? Chapter 6. The temperature of the soul. Cold, heat, and transformation. Water transforms its nature with temperature. This observation, which seems to belong exclusively to the realm of elementary physics, conceals, for those who examine it with the depth it deserves, one of the most precise and operationally useful analogies that nature offers for understanding the processes of internal transformation. Water, in its frozen state, is rigid, predictable, and resistant to change in shape. In its liquid state, it is adaptable, capable of taking the shape of any container and flowing around obstacles. In its vapor state, it has transcended the restriction of shape completely, becoming omnipresent in the space it occupies and capable of passing through barriers that would be impenetrable in its solid or liquid state. 3 states of the same substance, 3 radically different natures, all accessible through a single determining factor: temperature. Your soul, your deepest inner state, navigates through these 3 states with the same logic. There are temperatures of being that generate rigidity, creating the inner equivalent of ice, states of emotional freezing where the flow of life stops, where patterns become fixed in structures that actively resist movement. There are temperatures that favor fluidity, where adaptability is natural and transformation occurs without undue effort. And there are temperatures of high intensity, states of inner fire, that bring the being to its boiling point, where what was solid dissolves, where structures that seem permanent are released in an expansion that transcends any previous limits. Understanding the temperature of the soul as a determining factor in the healing process offers a roadmap for understanding why certain practices that work well for some people at certain times seem completely inaccessible or counterproductive for others. It's not that the practice is incorrect. It's that the individual's temperature at that moment is not appropriate for that type of intervention. A system in a frozen state experiencing acute trauma or deep dissociation cannot benefit from the same interventions as a system in a flow state, a system in a boiling state. In the midst of an intense emotional crisis, needs a different kind of attention than a system in a state of relative calm. The inner cold, the state of emotional numbness, is perhaps the state most people experience without recognizing it as such, because it is frequently confused with equanimity, with strength, with the control necessary to function in a world that does not tolerate emotional expressions considered excessive. The individual who has learned to freeze emotionally as a survival response often has an outwardly flawless demeanor. They are efficient, productive, capable of handling high-demand situations without apparent imbalance. But their body registers the cost of this numbness in the form of chronic tension, fatigue that does not subside with rest, a diffuse feeling of emptiness that appears in moments of stillness and is combated by filling time with more activity, more noise, more busyness. Internal heat, the state of heightened emotional activation, is not in itself the problem that the cultural narrative of self-control suggests it is. Heat is energy available for change. Heat is the state in which frozen patterns have the possibility of softening and flowing. The problem is not heat itself, but heat without conscious direction. Heat that becomes a wildfire, because there is no one within the individual who has learned to work with it. The healing this chapter proposes is not the extinguishing of emotional fire, but learning how to work with it, how to use its energy in a way that softens what was rigid without destroying what is still necessary. For each state of internal temperature, there is an appropriate practice. Freezing requires gentle movement, external physical warmth, contact, and the presence of another being to act as a reliable witness. The mid-temperature state, the fluid state, is where most of the processing work can occur most effectively. The boiling state requires containment, cooling breathing, and a structure that prevents energy from dispersing in all directions without producing any useful transformation. Develop the ability to recognize your current internal temperature before beginning any healing practice. Take a moment of silence and ask yourself, am I cold, in flow, or boiling right now? If you are cold, begin with gentle physical movement, mindful walking, slow stretching, or simply vigorously rubbing your hands together until they are warm and placing them on your chest. If you are in flow, this is your time for deeper work. Use the practices from the previous chapters. If you are boiling, before any other practice, do the 4 to 8 breath. 4 seconds of inhalation, 8 seconds of exhalation. Repeat 10 times until your internal temperature drops to a level that allows for mindful work. What is your predominant internal temperature at this time in your life? What patterns of behavior, relationships, or routines contribute to maintaining that temperature? What would you need to change to, more frequently, find the state of flow where healing flows more naturally? Chapter 7. The Healing Silence. The Zero Frequency. There is a frequency that most human beings in the contemporary era have not experienced in years, and some never in their fully conscious adult lives. It is the frequency of true silence. Not the relative silence of a room where there is no television on or conversations taking place. Not the superficial silence of a moment without obvious external auditory stimuli. The true silence to which this chapter refers is an inner condition of profound stillness, a state in which the noise of internal dialogue stops, in which the machinery of identity narrative pauses, in which the being experiences, however briefly, what exists before thought, begins its work of interpreting, categorizing, and judging everything it perceives. This silence is not the romantic ideal of a philosophy disconnected from practical reality. In concrete, neurophysiological terms, it is the state in which certain healing processes, impossible while the nervous system is in active processing mode, can unfold. The science of sleep and rest has documented that during states of lower brain activity, the body carries out consolidation, repair, and reorganization processes that are literally impossible during active wakefulness. Conscious silence, the deep meditative state, shares with sleep the characteristic of offering the nervous system a pause in processing that allows these restorative processes to activate, but with the crucial difference that the practitioner is present and can, with practice, learn to facilitate and guide some of what occurs in that state. The culture of constant productivity in which we live has fostered a relationship with silence that, for many, transforms it into an experience of profound discomfort rather than one of rest and restoration. When someone accustomed to continuous stimulation suddenly finds themselves in silence, the first thing they experience is not the peace they expected, but rather an amplification of all the internal noise that constant activity had been masking. Recurring thoughts, postponed worries, suppressed emotions, everything that external noise helped keep below the threshold of consciousness emerges with an intensity that can be overwhelming for someone inexperienced in dealing with it. This experience, which many people interpret as evidence that silence doesn't work for them or isn't suitable for their particular type of mind, is actually a sign that silence is working exactly as it should. What emerges in the silence isn't created by the silence. It was there all along. The silence simply creates the conditions in which what was already present can finally be perceived. And being perceived is the first step in any process of integration and healing. The practice of mindful silence progressively develops the capacity to be with what arises without automatically reacting to it, without being swept away by the current of thoughts and emotions that silence brings to the surface. This capacity, which is called by different names in contemplative traditions, but is all recognized as fundamental for spiritual and psychological development, has documented neurophysiological correlates. Sustained meditation practice modifies the activity of brain regions related to emotional regulation, reduces biological markers of chronic stress, and increases the coherence of heart rate variability, an indicator of the autonomic nervous system's equilibrium. Silence is also the space where the intelligence of the fluid body can communicate most clearly. The organism speaks constantly through sensations, subtle impulses, and variations in energy state that, amidst the constant noise of the contemporary world, are practically inaudible. In silence, these signals become perceptible. Intuition, that phenomenon situated between mystical experience and the organism's capacity to process subliminal information, flourishes in silence, precisely because it needs the noise of analytical thought to quiet down in order to be heard. Begin with what is manageable. If silence is a new or uncomfortable experience for you, start with 5 minutes a day and gradually increase the duration 1 week at a time until you reach 20 minutes. The process is as follows. Choose a consistent time, preferably in the morning before the day gets going. Sit with your spine straight, without leaning back to avoid drowsiness. Close your eyes. For the first 2 minutes, simply observe your breath without trying to change it. Then allow your awareness to expand into the space your breath inhabits. When a thought arises, and many will, simply notice it without following it. Imagine it is a cloud passing across the sky of your awareness. You are the sky, not the cloud. Return to observing the space. When you finish, write down one word that describes the state you found yourself in during the practice. What does silence mean to you? Is it an experience of rest, discomfort, fear, or relief? What does your habitual relationship with silence reveal about the kind of relationship you have with your own inner world? Chapter 8. Dialogues with Water. How to talk to your biology. There is a practice that, to someone encountering it for the first time, may seem exaggerated, even implausible, until they try it and experience its effects with the honesty of someone who allows direct experience to speak louder than preconceived notions. It is the practice of consciously speaking to your biology, of establishing an intentional dialogue with the fluids that make up your body, with the intelligence that governs your organism's processes below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. To understand why this practice has a basis beyond the purely symbolic, it is necessary to reconsider what it means to communicate with a biological system. Communication in the body doesn't occur exclusively through verbal language. The organism is a multidimensional communication system where information circulates through electrical signals in the nervous system, through messenger molecules in the bloodstream, through variations in the electromagnetic fields generated by the heart and brain, and through the patterns of biological water structure that we have been exploring. When you speak, when you generate sound with your vocal apparatus, you are producing mechanical vibrations that don't stop in the air. They are transmitted through your body's tissues, impact the fluids, and have effects that the science of cytomechanics, the study of how mechanical forces affect cellular behavior, has begun to document. Bioacoustic researchers have documented that cells respond to sound vibrations of specific frequencies with changes in their behavior, variations in membrane permeability, changes in proliferation rate, and modifications in gene expression. Sound is not a phenomenon that occurs outside the body and is simply perceived by the body. Internally produced sound, whether from the voice, the chanting of mantras, or simply the murmuring of intentionally chosen words, vibrates directly in the tissues and fluids of the organism that produces it. This opens up a perspective on verbal practice that goes far beyond positive affirmation as a psychological technique for cognitive reprogramming. Speaking to your body with words of care, recognition, gratitude, and intention is not just a mental exercise that changes what you think about yourself. It is an act of direct communication with your body's systems through the vibrational medium of sound. And biological systems, like any sophisticated communication system, respond differently to the quality of the signals they receive. The words you choose to inhabit your inner dialogue have consequences that transcend their semantic value. An inner dialogue that unfolds predominantly within the realm of self-criticism, harsh judgment, and narratives of inadequacy and shame not only produces an unpleasant psychological experience. It generates an internal, vibrational field with specific characteristics that the very essence of your being registers and stores. And an inner dialogue that operates from recognition, from self-compassion, from the affirmation of the capacity for transformation, and the intention to heal, produces a vibrational field with radically different characteristics. The practice of conscious dialogue with your biology requires no special beliefs or particular spiritual dispositions. It requires only the willingness to experiment with the hypothesis that your body hears what you say to it, to treat that possibility as an open experiment, and to honestly observe the results you obtain when you consistently change the quality of your internal dialogue over a period long enough for the system to respond. This week, establish a daily practice of mindful dialogue with your body. This can be done during the inner ocean recognition practice you've already been cultivating. With your hands on your body and your eyes closed, speak internally or in a very low voice, whichever feels most natural, addressing your body with the following words or your own versions that convey the same spirit. Begin with, "I am here with you. Thank you for continuing to function, for continuing to heal, for continuing to seek balance." Next, direct your attention to the area of greatest tension or discomfort you identified during your lab session and say to it, "I hear you. I know you've been carrying this for a long time. I'm ready to help you release it." Observe over the following days if there is any change, however subtle, in how that area of your body feels. How do you usually talk to your body? Carefully, impatiently, indifferently, critically? What do these patterns of internal dialogue reveal about your relationship with yourself at the most fundamental level? Chapter 9. The Geometry of the Wound. Why pain has a shape. One of the most surprising revelations that emerges from deep somatic work, that is, work that involves awareness of the body as the primary territory of healing, is the discovery that pain is not amorphous. Pain has structure. It has a recognizable geometry, a pattern of spatial organization in the body that varies according to the type of experience that generated it, and which, when one learns to read it, offers precise information about the nature of the work that still needs to be done. This geometry is not metaphorical. It is directly perceptible with sufficient practice of interoceptive awareness. People who have developed the ability to perceive their internal states in detail consistently report that different types of emotional pain have different sensory qualities and different locations in the body. The pain of grief has a sinking quality, a weight, a painful opening in the center of the chest. The pain of betrayal has a stabbing quality, a localized impact. The pain of chronic shame has a contracting quality, a shrinking sensation, an attempt to occupy as little space as possible. The pain of old fear has a freezing quality in the lower abdomen, a restriction in breathing capacity. These geometries are neither arbitrary nor merely subjective. They have correlates in the organization of the autonomic nervous system, in the activation patterns of different body regions according to the type of stress response that was dominant at the time the pain file was installed. The polyvagal paradigm of neuroscientist Stephen Porges has precisely described how different activation states of the autonomic nervous system manifest in recognizable physical patterns involving the tone of facial and vocal muscles, body posture, chest expansion or contraction, and the quality of presence the person projects to their environment. Learning to read the geometry of your wound is learning the language in which your body is telling you its story. Not in the language of abstract concepts or psychological narratives, but in the direct language of embodied sensation, which is always more precise and less susceptible to cognitive distortion than the verbal account of pain. The body does not lie about what it has experienced. Language can soften, rationalize, or distort. The physical sensation recorded in the fluids and tissues remains true to what actually happened. Understanding the geometry of the wound has immediate practical application in the healing process. It allows the work to be precisely directed to where it is needed, rather than operating generically on the internal state. When you know that the contraction in the chest is the geometry of unresolved grief, you can work specifically with that area, with that quality of sensation, with the kind of movement, breath, and presence that specific geometry needs to begin to open. When you recognize the freezing in the abdomen as the geometry of an old fear that took root, before you had words, you can specifically bring the warmth, movement, and safety that particular state needs to thaw. In your next silent practice, dedicate all available time to exploring the geometry of a difficult emotion you have identified in your process. When the emotion arises, instead of focusing on the narrative content of what triggered it, bring all your attention to the accompanying physical sensation. Explore its exact location in your body. Is it superficial or deep? Is it localized or diffuse? Does it have a temperature? Is it moving or static? If it had a geometric shape, what would it be? Draw that shape in your notebook and write next to it the words that describe its sensory qualities. This map is a navigational tool for your healing process. How does your relationship with pain change when you perceive it as information with a defined structure, rather than as a formless experience that simply happens to you? What implications does this difference have for how you approach healing work? Chapter 10. The Clean Channel. Removing Energy Blockages. In water distribution system engineering, one of the most costly and far-reaching problems is the gradual obstruction of pipelines. A pipe that becomes progressively clogged by the accumulation of mineral deposits doesn't produce a dramatic and immediate failure. It produces something more insidious, a gradual reduction in flow rate that occurs so slowly that system users sometimes don't even perceive it as a problem, but simply adjust their expectations to the lower available pressure, normalizing a decrease that in another context they would immediately recognize as unacceptable. The human energy system, the network through which vitality flows, fueling all the body's processes, operates under a similar logic. Energy blockages rarely appear suddenly and dramatically. They accumulate gradually over years and decades of small suppressions, of repeated decisions not to express oneself, not to move, not to feel what one is feeling. And with each small accumulation, the flow of vitality available for life, for creativity, for relationships, for the capacity to enjoy life and to project oneself into the future diminishes a little more. Until at some point, the individual looks back on their life and wonders when the energy, the enthusiasm, the feeling of being truly alive disappeared, without being able to identify any specific moment of rupture. Energy blockages have multiple origins and multiple forms of manifestation. They can stem from unprocessed traumas that have created areas of chronic tension in the tissues. They can arise from habitual, shallow breathing patterns that keep the body in a chronic state of oxygen deprivation, depriving it of the full oxygenation it needs to function at its maximum capacity. They can originate from relationships or environments that consume more energy than they provide, creating a sustained deficit that the body attempts to compensate for by restricting expenditure in areas it perceives as less urgent for immediate survival. They can be born from deeply ingrained beliefs about the unworthiness of fully existing, about the danger of being seen, about the threat posed by one's own desires, beliefs that the nervous system translates into a permanent physical restraint that restricts the flow of vitality from within. The work of clearing energy channels is not a brute force process. It's not about trying to force more energy through obstructed channels in the hope that the pressure will dissolve the blockages. It's about precisely identifying where the blockages are located and applying the specific interventions that each type of blockage requires to dissolve. A blockage of traumatic origin requires a different kind of work than a blockage of habitual origin, and both require different interventions than a blockage of relational origin. The cleansing of energy channels is also inextricably a process of reclaiming one's own voice, one's own presence, one's own capacity to occupy the space that rightfully belongs to each individual. Many energy blockages are, at their root, the physical expression of a decision to minimize oneself, to take up less space than is available, to be less visible, less audible, less present than one would naturally be in the absence of the fear or shame that generated that decision. Cleansing these channels is, in this sense, an act of personal courage as much as it is physical and energetic work. This week's practice is channel cleansing breathing. Sit with your spine straight. Inhale deeply through your nose, filling your abdomen first and then expanding your ribcage to its full capacity. At the peak of the inhalation, hold your breath for 3 seconds. Then exhale completely through your mouth with an audible sound, emptying your chest and then your abdomen. At the bottom of the exhalation, gently contract your pelvic floor and lower abdominal muscles to expel the last remaining air. Practice 10 cycles of this breathing each morning. After the 10th cycle, observe the quality of the sensation in your body, especially in your chest, abdomen, and throat. These are the areas where energy channels most frequently become blocked. In what areas of your life do you feel your energy isn't flowing freely? What do you think you've been avoiding feeling, expressing, or experiencing that might be causing this restriction of your vital energy? Chapter 11. The osmotic pressure of fear. Osmosis is the process by which a solvent, usually water, passes through a semi-permeable membrane from a region of lower solute concentration to a region of higher concentration, until equilibrium is established on both sides of the membrane. It is one of the fundamental mechanisms of cellular biology, responsible for maintaining the water balance of every cell in the body. And it is also one of the most accurate metaphors available to describe what fear does to your inner field when it is allowed to operate unchecked. Fear has osmotic pressure. It always moves from where it is most intense to where its concentration is lowest. If fear is present in high concentrations in your external environment, in the form of catastrophic news, relationships based on threat and insecurity, work environments that function under the pressure of constant fear, that fear will exert osmotic pressure on the interior of your biological field. And if there isn't a sufficiently robust selective membrane, a capacity to filter what enters the internal field from the outside, the fear will equalize. The concentration of fear within you will equal that of the environment until the pressure differential disappears, until you no longer feel the difference between the fear coming from outside and the fear coming from within. Because there is no longer a difference. They are the same concentration. Human beings who have developed a high permeability to environmental fear, who have grown up in environments where fear was the baseline state of functioning for the adults around them, develop a biological membrane with deficient selectivity toward fear. This is not because they are weak-willed or spiritually inferior, but because their nervous system learned early on that fear was the most important signal from the environment, the one with the most immediate consequences, and developed a particular sensitivity to it. What at the time of its development was an intelligent survival adaptation becomes, in the adult who no longer lives in the original environment of danger, a hypersensitivity to fear that causes any signal, even remotely resembling it, to trigger a full-blown alarm response. The osmotic pressure of fear also operates from within. The fear stored in the archives of past pain exerts constant pressure from the inside out, projecting itself onto the individual's interpretation of the present. A person who carries within their very being a file of the threat of abandonment will perceive signs of imminent abandonment in situations where an external observer would see none. A person whose internal field is saturated with the frequency of the fear of scarcity will perceive threatening scarcity in contexts of objective abundance. Internal fear creates its own pressure field that distorts the perception of the present. Building a robust, selective barrier against fear does not mean becoming insensitive to real danger. Fear serves a legitimate biological function when it signals a genuine threat that requires attention and a response. The selective barrier that healing work builds allows informative fear, the kind that signals real dangers, to be perceived clearly and responded to intelligently. While residual fear, the kind that signals no present danger but only the osmotic pressure of past experiences, is recognized as such and not allowed to contaminate our understanding of the present. Developing this discriminative ability requires time, practice, and the willingness to honestly examine the origin of each fear response. What part of this fear corresponds to a real threat in the present? What part of this fear is the osmotic pressure of a past experience installed years or decades ago? This distinction, applied consistently, progressively reduces the capacity of residual fear to govern present decisions, without dulling the sensitivity needed to recognize and respond to real dangers. The next time you feel a fear response, go through this three-step process before acting on that fear. First, pause. Engage your breath 4 to 8 to reduce physiological arousal. Second, ask yourself, what specific threat in the present is this fear pointing to? Describe it as concretely as possible. Third, ask yourself, do I recognize this feeling from an earlier time in my life? How old is this fear? If the present threat doesn't justify the intensity of the fear you're feeling, the difference is likely osmotic pressure from the past. Name it as such and move forward with greater freedom. What estimated percentage of the fears you experience in your daily life correspond to real threats in the present? And what percentage could be the osmotic pressure of files from the past that are still trying to balance your concentration? Chapter 12. Subterranean Currents. The unconscious as a deep river. Underground rivers are one of the most fascinating and least visible phenomena in hydrology. They flow in absolute darkness, sometimes for hundreds of kilometers, shaping the terrain they traverse with the same patience and force with which surface rivers sculpt visible landscapes. They are imperceptible from the surface, but their influence is decisive. They nourish springs that emerge in unexpected places, feed the roots of forests, determine soil stability, and sometimes, when conditions change drastically, modify the surface terrain in ways that seem sudden and inexplicable to those who observe only the surface. The human unconscious operates under a completely analogous logic. It is the deep river that flows beneath all conscious life, invisible from the ordinary perspective, but decisive in shaping everything that appears on the surface. Patterns of behavior that repeat themselves without the individual fully understanding why, preferences and aversions that seem to arise from nowhere, decisions made in milliseconds before conscious thought has a chance to intervene, dreams that carry messages coded in the language of images. All of this is the visible flow of the unconscious's subterranean currents finding their points of emergence to the surface. The relationship a person has with their inner currents varies enormously, depending on their level of self-awareness. At one end of the spectrum is the individual who lives completely governed by these inner currents without any conscious awareness. This person experiences life as a sequence of events that simply happen to them, a series of external circumstances that carry them from one place to another without their conscious will having much influence on the direction the journey takes. When patterns repeat themselves, when the same painful situations emerge again and again with different actors but identical dynamics, this individual tends to interpret the repetition as bad luck, as the injustice of an adverse fate, or as confirmation that this is simply how life is and will continue to be. At the other extreme is the being who has developed an active dialogue with their subterranean currents, who has learned to perceive the signs of their flow, to read the messages of dreams and intense emotional reactions as valuable information about what is happening in the depths, and to consciously work with that material to guide the inner river toward where conscious life wants to go. This is not the being who has eliminated the unconscious, who has controlled it or subjected it to rational will. It is the being who has established an alliance with it, who recognizes it as a source of wisdom and energy that can collaborate with consciousness instead of operating against it. Working with the subterranean currents of the unconscious is one of the most delicate and potentially transformative aspects of the healing process. It is delicate because the unconscious holds the material that the nervous system deemed too intense to be consciously processed at the time, and exploring those depths requires the kind of presence and security we have been building in previous chapters. And it is transformative because these subterranean currents possess enormous potential energy that, when integrated with consciousness, instead of operating from the shadows, becomes an extraordinary source of creativity, intuition, vitality, and the capacity for deep connection with life. Start keeping a dream journal. For the next 30 days, each morning upon waking, before getting out of bed or checking any device, take a piece of paper and write down everything you remember from your dreams the night before, no matter how fragmented or absurd they may seem. Don't try to interpret them intellectually. Simply record them as accurately as possible. After 2 weeks, review what you've written and look for recurring patterns, themes that appear repeatedly, predominant emotions, figures that reappear. These patterns are the map of the most active undercurrents in your subconscious right now. What aspect of your current life might be being shaped by an undercurrent you haven't been conscious enough to perceive? What would the recurring patterns in your dreams, relationships, or automatic emotional responses reveal about yourself? Chapter 13. The Boiling Point. When crisis is the catalyst. There comes a moment in the life of almost every human being who's been on the path of healing for some time that could be described as the point of no return. It is not necessarily the most dramatic or most painful moment of their history, although it sometimes coincides with one of them. It is the moment when the accumulation of internal pressure reaches a threshold that the system can no longer ignore. The point when the temperature of suffering has risen enough that what was solid and fixed can no longer remain in that state. It is the boiling point. And understanding its nature, its function, and its enormous transformative potential is one of the most powerful keys this book can offer you. Contemporary culture has a profoundly ambivalent relationship with crises. On the one hand, it fears them with an intensity reflected in the amount of energy people invest in preventing them, postponing them, and mitigating their effects before they occur. On the other hand, there is a collective understanding that major transformations of individuals and civilizations generally arise from crises, not from periods of sustained comfort. This ambivalence is resolved when the true nature of crisis is understood as a biological and existential phenomenon. A crisis is not, in its essence, an external event that disrupts a life that would otherwise unfold harmoniously. A crisis is the visible manifestation of pressure that has been accumulating within internal systems long enough to overwhelm the capacity of the usual coping mechanisms. An unexpected medical diagnosis, the breakup of a seemingly stable relationship, the loss of a job or a source of financial security, the emergence of a conflict that can no longer be postponed. In all these cases, the external event is not the crisis itself. It is the trigger that makes visible the pressure that was already present, that was already seeking an outlet. When water is heated to its boiling point, the transformation that occurs is not the destruction of the water. Water does not cease to be water when it boils. It changes state. The same substance that in its solid state was rigid and immovable, that in its liquid state was adaptable but still subject to gravity and the shape of its containers, in its gaseous state is freed from restrictions that previously seemed absolute. It rises. It occupies the available space without resistance. It passes through barriers that in previous states were impenetrable. Boiling does not destroy. It liberates. The crises of human life, when faced with presence and understanding, rather than panic and resistance, serve precisely the same function. They bring the system to a point of sufficient temperature for the patterns that were crystallized in rigid structures, those that governed life through the inertia of habit and fear of change, to be forced to shift. Identities that no longer serve them soften. Relationships maintained out of fear of loneliness rather than genuine love are forced to reveal their true nature. Projects sustained by what others might say, rather than by an authentic calling, lose their apparent weight. Everything that was only kept in its fixed form by the inertia of the low temperature of conformity is exposed to the heat of crisis and revealed in its true nature. The difference between someone who emerges from a crisis transformed and someone who emerges merely wounded and exhausted does not lie in the intensity of the crisis itself. It lies in the inner stance from which it is experienced. Those who face the crisis with the attitude of a system that resists the heat, that tries to lower the temperature at all costs, that struggles to return to the previous state in haste, experience the boiling process as senseless suffering that they simply want to end. Those who face the crisis with the understanding that the heat is releasing something that needed to be released, that the breaking down of fixed forms is the price of access to greater freedom, can walk through the same fire with a presence that transforms suffering into information, chaos into the raw material of a more authentic life. This doesn't mean that crises don't hurt. They do. Sometimes with an intensity that would be dishonest to minimize with easy words of comfort. It means that the pain of a crisis can be navigated in two radically different ways, with resistance that amplifies and prolongs it, or with presence that allows it to be fully what it is while it lasts, and that extracts from it all the meaning and all the transformation it contains. The person who learns to be present at their boiling points, who develops the capacity to remain coherent even when the temperature of life rises to levels that would trigger panic in any less trained system, discovers that crises are not their enemies. They are their most effective teachers and their most powerful catalysts. The next time you feel the temperature in your life rising beyond what you can comfortably control, before making any move to bring it down, ask yourself this question with all the honesty you can muster. What is trying to break free here? What structure that no longer serves me is being brought to its boiling point so that it can change state? The answer that emerges from that honest silence will always be more valuable than any hasty cooling off strategy. Think about the most recent crisis you've experienced or are currently experiencing. In your notebook, write an honest answer to these questions. What was the first thing your inner system wanted to do to end the crisis as quickly as possible? What would have happened? What would have remained the same if that quick shutdown strategy had worked completely? What has begun to shift, to reveal itself, or to be released as a direct result of the temperature rising? Write unfiltered for at least 15 minutes and allow the answers to surprise you. What is the crisis in your life from which you have learned the most? The one that in retrospect you recognize as a boiling point that changed you in ways that wouldn't have been possible without that heat. What did that experience teach you about your own ability to walk through the fire and emerge transformed? Chapter 14. The memory that poisons. Dissolving the past. The past does not exist anywhere in the physical universe. This statement, which at first glance seems like a philosophical triviality or a conceptual provocation without practical consequences, is actually one of the most operationally useful truths that a person seeking healing can incorporate into their understanding of the process. The past does not exist as an objective reality in any dimension of space or time that you can point to. What exists are representations of the past, active reconstructions that the nervous system performs in the present using fragments of information stored in different memory systems of the organism. And these reconstructions, although they present themselves with the vivid sensation of being faithful reproductions of what happened, are always selective and interpreted approximations, not objective and neutral recordings. This has a profound implication for the healing process. The past doesn't trap you because it's real and unchangeable. The past traps you because the nervous system repeatedly reconstructs it with a fidelity that produces the same physiological responses in the present as the original event. The memory that poisons is not recollection as neutral storage of information. It's recollection as the repeated activation of the same biological response patterns that the original event triggered, an activation pattern that no longer corresponds to any real threat in the present, but which the system executes automatically every time a stimulus sufficiently similar to the original sets off the cascade. The water of your biology is the medium where this repetition perpetuates itself. Each activation of a painful memory recharges the molecular patterns that memory originally generated. With each recharge, the patterns reinforce themselves, becoming more accessible and requiring increasingly less specific stimuli to activate. Over time, a memory that initially required a very precise stimulus, similar to the original event, to activate can eventually be triggered by any situation that shares even the most vaguely similar elements. The poisonous memory expands progressively, coloring more and more areas of present experience with its frequency. Dissolving the past doesn't mean forgetting what happened. Memory, as a repository of learning, as a source of wisdom derived from lived experience, is a valuable resource that no authentic healing process seeks to eliminate. What is sought is the capacity of certain memories to trigger emergency responses in the present that correspond to the past. The difference between an integrated memory and a poisonous memory is precisely this. The former informs without contaminating. The latter activates without providing useful information about the present. The process of dissolving the past in the fluid body requires three fundamental movements that operate sequentially, but in practice often intertwine in non-linear ways. The first movement is recognition, accurately recognizing which specific memories are active as sources of present-day poisoning, without the drama of victimhood or the detached coldness of someone trying to treat their own wounds as if they were someone else's statistics. The second movement is full feeling, allowing the activated memory to be fully experienced in the body, not at the level of conceptual narrative, but at the level of physical sensations, movement impulses, and the emotions that emerge when the system finally allows itself to process what was once too much to handle. The third movement is updating, introducing new information that the nervous system can use to modify the memory's reconsolidation. Information about the safety of the present, the temporal distance from the original danger, and the resources and responsiveness that the current adult possesses, but that the child or younger self did not. This process doesn't happen in a single practice session. It happens in layers, spiraling, with forward movements and apparent setbacks that are part of the natural rhythm of integration. Patience with the process itself is as important here as any specific technique. Water dissolves rock not with a single blow, but with the constancy of its flow over time. Choose a memory from the past that still has the power to trigger emotional pain in the present. Sit quietly with that memory for 10 minutes. Instead of getting caught up in the narrative of what happened, bring your attention to the physical sensations the memory is creating in your body right now. Locate those sensations in your body as precisely as you can. Stay with them without trying to change them for 5 minutes. Then, from the place of the adult you are today, tell the part of you that experienced that moment. That happened. It's over. You are safe now. Notice what changes in the bodily sensations when you introduce this updating information. Write down what you observe. How old is the most frequent fear you experience? Does that fear correspond to something happening in your current life? Or is it primarily the activation of a memory from a time when you didn't have the resources you have today? I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you that if what you see here resonates with you, you'll find much more material to continue learning in the first link in the description. Chapter 15. Hydration of the Spirit. Nourishing the Conscience. If there were a single practice that no one undergoing healing should omit, a single condition without which all other work of inner transformation loses a substantial part of its effectiveness, it would be this: nourishing the consciousness with the same intention and consistency with which we nourish the physical body. Sustained healing cannot occur in a void of beauty, meaning, or expansion. It requires a continuous nourishment of the inner field with experiences, ideas, presences, and practices that raise the baseline frequency from which the being operates. We will call this process of deliberately nourishing the consciousness hydration of the spirit, and it is as literally necessary for the health of the inner field as physical hydration is for the health of the body. Human consciousness, like any living system, tends toward entropy when it doesn't receive sufficient energy and order. Left adrift with the random stimuli of the contemporary environment, without a deliberate practice of selecting and cultivating what nourishes it, consciousness tends to descend progressively toward denser frequencies. Cynicism disguised as realism, apathy presented as equanimity, emotional detachment sold as maturity. These states are not inevitable. They are the predictable result of a consciousness that isn't receiving the nourishment it needs to maintain its higher frequencies. The hydration of the spirit has multiple sources, and part of each being's work in their healing process is to identify which of these sources are most genuinely nourishing and not merely stimulating in the superficial sense of the term. Superficial stimulation, entertainment that produces a fleeting spark of activation followed by a greater emptiness than before, does not nourish. It can even dehydrate consciousness, returning it to lower frequencies more quickly than if no stimulus had occurred. Genuine nourishment is that which leaves the being more expansive, more present, more connected to something that transcends the usual boundaries of everyday identity after the experience that provided it. For many people, natural beauty is one of the most readily available sources of hydration. Contact with natural environments, the movement of water, the silence of forests, the vastness of open landscapes, produces documented effects on the nervous system, including reduced stress markers, increased heart rate coherence, and the activation of brain states associated with expanded awareness and reduced threat response activity. Nature hydrates the spirit in ways that the artificially stimulated urban environment can rarely replicate. Not because the city is inherently inferior, but because natural environments speak directly to the nervous system in the language it recognizes as its original evolutionary context. Beauty created by humankind can be equally nourishing when received with genuine presence and not merely as background cultural consumption. Music that unlocks something in the heart that was closed. A poem that names what had remained nameless. A visual work that produces that instant inner silence of someone who has recognized something true. All these experiences are acts of hydration of consciousness that produce changes in the inner field, as real as those produced by more formal practices of inner work. Connecting with others who operate from frequencies of genuine openness, honesty, and love is perhaps the most powerful and undervalued source of nourishment in a culture that has elevated independence and self-sufficiency to absolute virtues. Human beings are co-emotional organisms. Our nervous systems regulate each other in ways that interpersonal neurobiology has documented in increasing detail. Being in the presence of someone who operates from coherence, openness, and warmth regulates the observer's nervous system in ways that no solitary practice can fully produce. Nourishing the spirit is not a luxury or an indulgence granted only after all obligations have been fulfilled. It is a biological and existential need as fundamental as physical hydration. And treating it as such, allocating time and deliberate attention to it within the structure of each day, is one of the most profoundly responsible acts a person undergoing healing can perform for themselves. This week, identify 3 sources of genuine hydration for your consciousness and commit to accessing each one at least once during the next 7 days. These could be a walk in nature, deep listening to music that opens your heart, a completely honest conversation with someone you trust, reading something that expands your worldview, or any other practice that, in your experience, produces genuine expansion and not just fleeting stimulation. Before and after each experience, record in your journal the state of your inner field on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is maximum contraction and 10 is maximum expansion. Observe the patterns that emerge. What sources of nourishment for your consciousness have you been postponing or neglecting during this period of your life? What has been the real cost in terms of the quality of your inner field, of that postponement? Chapter 16. The flow of gratitude. The most healing molecule. There's a practice that has been so overused in personal development circles, so reduced to a superficial formula by the wellness market, that many people who have been on the path of awareness for some time receive it with a mixture of boredom and skepticism that prevents them from accessing what genuine gratitude, practiced with real depth and not as a mere ritual, can do for the inner being of the one who inhabits it. Authentic gratitude is not a positive psychological exercise designed to convince you that your life is better than it seems. It's a biological frequency with measurable effects on the water in your body, on the coherence of your nervous system, and on the chemical composition of the fluids circulating in your body every time you genuinely experience it. To understand why gratitude has such healing power, when practiced authentically, it's necessary to grasp the fundamental difference between 2 operations that superficially resemble one another, but produce radically different biological effects. The first operation is the thought of gratitude, the cognitive activity of listing things one should be grateful for, of intellectually acknowledging positive aspects in one's situation. This operation has limited psychological value, but doesn't produce the profound biological effects that the practice of genuine gratitude can generate. The second operation is the state of gratitude, the bodily experience of openness, warmth in the chest, and connection with life that emerges when one truly allows oneself to feel the value of what one has, what one has received, and what exists in one's field, regardless of what is lacking. The state of gratitude, as opposed to merely thinking about gratitude, activates the parasympathetic nervous system with a consistency and speed that few other experiences can match. When gratitude is genuinely felt and not just thought about, it produces a pattern of heart rate variability that researchers at the Heart Math Institute have identified as heart coherence, a state in which the heart rhythm acquires an orderly regularity that has cascading positive effects on virtually every system in the body. In heart coherence, blood pressure tends to normalize, the immune system becomes more effective, the production of stress hormones decreases, and the production of DHEA, a hormone associated with vitality and longevity, increases. For the water within your biology, a state of genuine gratitude produces something that could be described as a clarification of the environment. The fluids that, in a state of chronic stress or sustained fear, exhibit a chemical composition that promotes inflammation and tissue rigidity, are bathed in a radically different biochemistry in a state of sustained gratitude, a biochemistry that fosters regeneration, fluidity, and coherence. The internal water, which under the pressure of fear and negativity tends toward less ordered molecular patterns, tends toward patterns of greater organization and harmony in a state of gratitude. Gratitude also dissolves one of the most persistent and widespread pain files, the E file of inadequacy. The being who inhabits a state of genuine gratitude is, by definition, experiencing what they have as enough, what is as enough, the present moment as enough. This state is the exact antithesis of the narrative of inadequacy that most pain files installed in childhood somehow reproduce. No amount of cognitive work can dissolve the file of inadequacy as effectively as the direct and sustained experience of sufficiency that genuine gratitude provides. The practice of deep gratitude doesn't require extraordinarily positive circumstances. It requires the ability to find the miracle within the ordinary, a miracle that routine has rendered us incapable of perceiving. The water you drink this morning, your body continuing to function despite all you've asked it to endure, the light streaming through the window, the fact that your heart is beating right now without you having to think about it, the gratitude that arises from truly perceiving these realities without the layer of obviousness imposed by habit, creates an opening of the inner field that is the ideal condition for any other healing work to find the receptive ground it needs to bear fruit. Each night before sleep, spend 5 minutes on the following deep gratitude practice. Close your eyes and bring your attention to the center of your chest. Recall a specific moment from the day, not necessarily grand, when you experienced something of real value, a conversation that made you feel seen, a moment of beauty, the feeling that your body responded well, a moment of clarity or connection. Recall that moment in enough detail that your body can feel something of what it felt then. Stay in that feeling for at least 2 minutes. Notice what is happening in your body as you do this. Then sleep from that state. The quality of sleep that follows a genuine gratitude practice is noticeably different from the sleep that follows a state of worry. When was the last time you completely stopped to appreciate something ordinary in your life and truly felt it as the miracle it is? What has been preventing that experience from becoming more frequent in your daily life? Chapter 17. Emotional precipitation. From storm to calm. In the planet's hydrological cycle, precipitation is the process by which water vapor accumulated in clouds reaches a condensation point sufficient to fall back to Earth as rain, snow, or hail. It is the moment when the energy that the sun's heat lifted from the surface, transforming liquid water into vapor and carrying it to higher altitudes, is finally released in a form that can nourish the soil, feed rivers, and recharge underground aquifers. Without precipitation, the water cycle stops. Vapor accumulates indefinitely in the atmosphere without finding a way to complete its cycle. The earth dries out. Life shrinks. The emotional life of human beings follows the same cycle. Emotions are, in their most fundamental nature, energy that rises from lived experience, accumulates in the inner field until it reaches a point of sufficient density to seek release. And when it can complete its cycle naturally, it returns to the system in a form that nourishes it rather than pollutes it. Tears that emerge and are released leave the body lighter, not heavier. Anger that is expressed appropriately and dissolves leaves the system clearer, not more turbulent. Fear that is fully processed becomes accumulated courage, not additional trauma. The problem generated by the pathological accumulation of unprocessed emotions is exactly the same as that generated by the accumulation of atmospheric vapor without precipitation. When emotional energy cannot complete its natural discharge cycle, whether because the environment is unsafe, because internalized cultural norms block it, or because the nervous system has learned to cut off the process before it reaches its point of precipitation, that energy remains suspended in the internal field, progressively increasing the system's pressure until it either finds a point of discharge in a form the individual did not choose, such as a disproportionate emotional outburst in response to a minor stimulus, or it becomes trapped in patterns of chronic tension that continually drain the organism's resources. The emotional storm, that state of high intensity that most human beings fear and flee from with all their available avoidance strategies, is frequently the sign that a necessary precipitation is about to occur. Not every storm is welcome. Not every emotional intensity is a sign of integration work underway. But the ability to distinguish between the storm that is heralding a necessary precipitation and the emotional chaos that leads to no genuine integration is one of the most valuable skills that the healing process progressively develops. Guided emotional precipitation, the process of consciously allowing accumulated emotional energy to complete its natural cycle with enough presence for it to become integration rather than simply chaotic discharge, requires 3 conditions. The first is safety, an internal and, when necessary, external environment where the nervous system can perceive that completing the emotional cycle will not pose a real threat. The second is witness presence, the ability to be present with one's own storm without being completely swept away, to maintain a part of one's consciousness that observes the process from a distance, that allows the work to occur without the self being dissolved into it. The third is trust in the process, the understanding that the intensity of the storm is not a measure of the damage it is causing, but rather a measure of the energy being released, and that on the other side of genuine precipitation, there is always a calm that is qualitatively different from the calm of suppression. When the cycle is complete, when the storm has passed and the energy has found its way to discharge and transform, the body registers the change with an unmistakable fidelity. There is a specific lightness that follows a genuinely completed emotional release, a quality of openness in the chest, of greater fluidity in movement, of greater clarity in the perception of the present that no suppression mechanism can artificially create. It is the sign that the cycle is complete, that the vapor has become water again, that the earth can drink. Identify an emotion you've been holding back, one that feels like it's been building up without finding its breaking point. Create the necessary safe conditions, a private space, uninterrupted time, and, if needed, the presence of someone you trust who can witness the process. Then, deliberately, allow that emotion to be fully present. Don't direct or control it once it has begun. Allow the body to do what it needs to do. Cry, tremble, vocalize, move. The only limit is that the process doesn't involve actions that harm others or yourself. After the storm has passed, remain silent for 10 minutes before doing anything else. Observe the quality of the calm that follows. What emotions have you been holding back the longest? What do you think would happen if you allowed them to complete their natural cycle of release? What part of you fears that release? And what exactly does it fear will happen? Chapter 18. The Liquid Mirror. How the environment reflects your internal state. One of the observations that most resists initial acceptance by those approaching the perspective of radical responsibility for their own experience for the first time is this: the external environment functions as a high-fidelity mirror of the internal state. Not absolutely, nor in a simplistic way. Not every difficult circumstance that occurs in a person's life is a projection of their inner world, and reducing human suffering to a mere consequence of erroneous states of consciousness is a distortion that lacks both accuracy and compassion. But there is a level of relationship between the internal state and the quality of experiences one attracts, generates, and perpetuates in the external world that is consistent and documentable enough that ignoring it carries a real cost in terms of one's ability to transform one's life. The liquid mirror does not reflect instantaneously or mechanically like a glass mirror reflects the image placed before it. It operates with the dynamics of the water, which reflects the landscape on its surface. When the water is agitated, the reflection is distorted and unrecognizable. When the water is calm, the reflection is precise and revealing. And the reflection is never identical to the real object. It has its own properties, its own inversions and transformations, but it maintains a relationship with the original that allows us to recognize the correspondence. This is how the relationship between the inner state of being and the quality of the environment that being creates and attracts operates. Relationship patterns are the most immediate mirror and often the most difficult to look directly into. The types of bonds one repeatedly establishes, the dynamics reproduced with different actors but identical structures, the emotional quality of the interactions that predominate in an individual's social life. All of this is high-resolution information about the frequency that individual is transmitting from their inner field. Not because others are mindless puppets who simply respond to the field's signals, but because the unconscious selection of whom to connect with, what signals to perceive in the environment as opportunities or threats, what aspects of others to amplify in one's own perception and which to minimize. All of this is profoundly shaped by the state of the observer's internal fluids. Working with the liquid mirror requires a particular kind of courage, the willingness to ask, when faced with each difficult pattern that repeats itself in the external environment, what in the internal field might be contributing to its persistence. This question is not an exercise in self-criticism or blame. It is a genuine research question, posed with the curiosity of a scientist examining data without a preconceived agenda about what it should reveal. And the patterns that emerge from this honest investigation are invariably more informative about the actual territory of the internal field than any abstract analysis of one's own psychology. The mirror can also reveal luminous aspects of the inner field that the individual hasn't fully recognized within themselves. Those who admire you or feel deeply connected to you are, in part, reflecting back to you frequencies they recognize in your field, frequencies that perhaps you yourself haven't yet learned to recognize with the clarity and appreciation they deserve. The liquid mirror doesn't just show the shadows, it also shows the light. And learning to receive both with the same honest gaze is part of the process of building a more complete and authentic inner image of who you truly are. Choose a pattern in your external life that repeats itself consistently enough that you no longer consider it a coincidence. It might be a type of conflict that reappears in different relationships, a type of obstacle that repeatedly arises in your projects, or a quality of experience that dominates a specific area of your life. In your notebook, describe the external pattern as precisely as possible. Then ask yourself and write without censorship. If this pattern were a mirror, what internal state of mind might it be reflecting? What belief, what fear, what dominant emotional frequency might be generating or perpetuating this pattern? Don't look for the right answer. Look for the honest answer. What pattern in your external environment have you been blaming on factors completely outside of yourself? What small chance, even 10%, is there that this pattern has something to do with an internal state that you haven't yet fully recognized or addressed? Chapter 19. The Alchemy of Forgiveness. Turning poison into medicine. Forgiveness is the most misunderstood practice on the spiritual path and in psychological healing. It has been presented so often as an act of moral generosity toward the one who caused the harm, as a gift the offended party bestows upon the offender, that many people who carry legitimate and deep wounds resist it with a conviction that seems, understandably, the only way to preserve the integrity of their experience, to avoid betraying the real suffering they endured. And this resistance, although born from a confusion about what forgiveness truly is, deserves to be understood before being questioned, because within it lies a correct intuition that should not be dismissed. The correct intuition is this: not everything that happens deserves to be normalized, minimized, or excused. There are acts whose harm is real, whose gravity should not be diminished by any spiritual process that calls itself forgiveness. Resistance to forgiveness often protects this truth with a ferocity that would reveal its importance even if no one explicitly stated it. But the confusion generated by this resistance is equally clear when examined without defensiveness. Genuine forgiveness has nothing to do with exonerating the act that caused the harm. Genuine forgiveness is solely about one's own release from the poison that sustained resentment injects into the inner field of the one who harbors it. Resentment, in concrete biological terms, is a state of sustained activation of the body's threat system. Keeping the memory of a past injustice active with enough emotional intensity to continue generating responses of anger, pain, or fear in the present is equivalent to keeping the biochemistry of stress circulating in the bloodstream in a state of activation that doesn't correspond to any real present threat. The water in your body faithfully records this state and maintains it as the baseline frequency from which the system operates. The person who harmed you years or decades ago is no longer necessarily present in your life, but their impact lives on in the chemical composition of your blood every time resentment triggers the memory of what happened. The alchemy of forgiveness transforms this poison into medicine through a process that requires no communication with the person who caused the harm, no reconciliation of any kind, no denial of what happened. It requires only the sovereign decision to withdraw your vital energy from maintaining the record of the injustice, not because the injustice wasn't real, but because the cost of keeping it active in your life is a price you are no longer willing to pay with your present vitality. Genuine forgiveness is an act of sacred selflessness, the act of choosing your own life over the story that binds you to the past. This process rarely happens all at once. Deep forgiveness moves in a spiral. It has layers, areas that open up and areas that cannot yet open because the work hasn't gotten close enough to them. There are aspects of certain wounds that take years to be truly forgiven, not because the forgiver is spiritually insufficient, but because the wound has multiple layers, and each layer needs its own processing time before it can be released. Patience with the process of forgiveness itself is an inseparable part of its practice. When forgiveness is complete, when the energy held in maintaining resentment is released, the space that resentment occupied in our inner field is not left empty. It is filled with the energy that returns to the system once it ceases to be consumed in maintaining a conflict that no longer belongs to the present. It is this released energy that becomes medicine, a new capacity to trust, to open up, to create, to love without the armor that resentment kept raised as protection against any new wound of the same kind. Forgiveness cannot be forced, but it can be invited. In your silent practice this week, bring to your awareness someone toward whom you still harbor resentment or an unhealed wound. Not to forgive them yet, but to honestly examine what it is costing you to keep that resentment alive. Ask yourself, what energy in my present life is being consumed by maintaining this record? What would I do with that energy if it were available for my current life? Don't make any decisions during the practice. Just observe the actual cost and write it down in your journal as accurately as possible. To whom in your life or history have you unknowingly been giving the power to continue affecting your present biochemistry through the resentment you've held on to? What would it mean for your personal freedom to reclaim that energy? Chapter 20. Toxic Sources. Identifying what's contaminating. Your field healing doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within the context of a life that continues to unfold, relationships that continue to demand a response, and environments that continue to transmit their frequencies to the inner field of the being who is working to transform. And one of the most frequent and underestimated obstacles on the path to healing is the persistence of sources of contamination that the being hasn't identified clearly enough, or that they have identified but haven't addressed by taking the necessary steps, either out of fear of the consequences of those decisions or because of a misguided kind of loyalty that confuses love with tolerating harm. Toxic sources for our inner well-being are more varied and subtle than the simplistic categorization of toxic versus positive people suggests. Some people are not inherently harmful, but in their relationship with a specific individual, they consistently trigger that person's pain patterns, not out of malice, but because of a resonance between their patterns and the other person's. This resonance creates a dynamic of mutual activation that is difficult to sustain without conscious effort from both parties. Some work environments, due to the nature of their power dynamics, the pressure they exert, or the values they embody, are incompatible with the inner well-being of certain individuals, regardless of how much inner work they do outside of work hours. and some media content is designed with the psychological precision of someone who knows exactly what triggers collective fear and insecurity, and who deliberately and repeatedly activates these triggers to keep the viewer in a state of heightened awareness that encourages consumption. There are also sources of internal contamination that don't come from outside but are generated from within. The internal dialogue of chronic self-criticism, habitual judgments about oneself and others, narratives of inadequacy, victimization, or hopelessness that the system automatically reproduces, and thought patterns that magnify threats and minimize available resources. These internal sources of contamination are often the most difficult to identify precisely because they are the most familiar, those that have been part of the mental landscape the longest, and which are therefore mistaken for objective reality instead of being recognized as patterns that can be transformed. The process of identifying toxic sources requires a particular kind of honesty that goes against several cultural conditionings simultaneously. It goes against the conditioning of unconditional loyalty, which teaches that acknowledging that a relationship is harmful is a betrayal. It goes against the conditioning of endurance, which teaches that bearing it without complaint is a virtue. It goes against the conditioning of emotional stoicism, which teaches that a strong person doesn't need a supportive environment because they are entirely self-sufficient. All of these conditionings contain a grain of truth. All of them can also be used by fear to keep a person in contact with sources that progressively harm them. The precise identification of toxic sources in one's life does not necessarily lead to radical and immediate withdrawal from all of them. Rather, it aims for a clear awareness of what they are, the real impact they have on one's inner field, and the making of informed and gradual decisions about how to manage that exposure in ways that serve the healing process instead of hindering it. Sometimes, the decision is complete withdrawal. Sometimes it is establishing boundaries that regulate exposure. Sometimes it is working together with the source of contamination, when that source is also a being who is suffering and open to transforming the dynamic. Wisdom lies in distinguishing between these possibilities and acting accordingly. This week, conduct an honest audit of the sources of pollution in your field. In your notebook, draw 3 columns. In the first, list the relationships, environments, and content that consistently leave your inner field in a lower state after exposure. In the second, describe the specific type of impact each one produces. In the third, write one concrete and realistic action you could take regarding each source to reduce its impact on your healing process. You don't have to take these actions immediately, but the act of naming them precisely is, in itself, an act of sovereignty over your field. What source of contamination have you been tolerating the longest while telling yourself it doesn't matter that much? What does tolerating that source, for as long as you have, reveal about your relationship with your own worth? Chapter 21. The Stream of Purpose. Finding your natural direction. There is a quality of movement that distinguishes water flowing along its natural gradient from water moved by a mechanical pump. Water flowing along its gradient does so with an efficiency that no artificial technology can fully replicate. It finds the paths of least resistance with an intelligence that seems impossible for something without a brain. It distributes itself in ways that nourish the maximum area with the minimum expenditure of energy. Ultimately, it has an intrinsic direction, a tendency toward which it moves when not artificially forced in any other direction. Human beings possess their own natural inclination. There is a direction toward which the inner field tends when freed from the superimposition of externally imposed duties, from the internalized expectations of others, and from fears that point toward the opposite pole of what genuinely attracts. This natural direction is what spiritual traditions call purpose or vocation, and what humanistic psychology calls the organism's actualizing tendency, the innate inclination of the living being toward its own fullest unfolding. Finding your own sense of purpose isn't always a moment of dramatic revelation, as popular culture tends to portray it. More often, it's a gradual process of cutting through the noise, of peeling back the layers of shoulds and can'ts that obscure the signal of your natural direction beneath strata of accumulated conditioning. It's the process of learning to distinguish between the genuine enthusiasm that comes from the natural flow of being and the borrowed enthusiasm derived from the success stories of others that culture offers as models. The clues to the flow of purpose don't always manifest as explicit passions or obvious talents. Sometimes they appear as a persistent and specific discomfort with the absence of something, a feeling that a certain kind of contribution to the world is needed, and that no one else seems to be making it the way you know it could be done. Sometimes they appear as the ease with which certain kinds of work flow effortlessly, while others drain your energy no matter how much you practice them. Sometimes they appear in recurring dreams, in conversations that drag on longer than planned, because the level of energy and presence they generate is qualitatively different from most everyday interactions. The flow of purpose and the healing process are inseparable in a way that is rarely clearly stated. Healing that doesn't connect with purpose tends to become a mindless maintenance exercise, the care of an instrument that is never played. And purpose pursued without the prior or simultaneous healing of the painful memories that distort it tends to be pursued from the same frequencies of fear and inadequacy that generated the original suffering, producing external achievements that don't deliver the promised satisfaction, because the field from which they were attained continues to operate at its densest frequencies. The integration of the flow of purpose with the inner field healing work is the condition for what might be called a life in flow, not in the sense of a life without difficulties, but in the sense of a life where the general direction of movement is in alignment with the natural gradient of being, where the effort invested has the kind of energetic feedback that only activity aligned with one's vocation produces, and where even difficulties and obstacles are processed from a field that has enough vitality and clarity of direction to find in them resources and opportunities rather than confirmations of failure. Sit in silence for 15 minutes and allow yourself to answer this question more from your body than your intellect. If fear and what others think were completely irrelevant, where would my energy naturally flow? What kind of contribution to the world would sustainably elevate my inner field, not as a fleeting stimulus, but as constant fuel? Don't look for the perfect or the grandest answer. Look for the most honest one. Write it down in your notebook without editing or justifying it. What percentage of your current time are you moving in the direction of your natural gradient? What has justified so far the percentage that moves in the opposite direction? Chapter 22. The Crystal of Intention. Structuring Reality. When water cools below its freezing point under sufficiently slow and still conditions, it doesn't become an amorphous block of ice. It organizes itself into crystals, and water crystals are structures of such beauty and geometric complexity that they have fascinated observers ever since magnification technology made their contemplation possible. Each snowflake is a unique crystal, generated by the particular history of temperature, humidity, and pressure it experienced during its formation. But all water crystals share a fundamental characteristic. They are the result of a process of spontaneous organization guided by the laws of water's molecular geometry. They are the expression of an intrinsic order that emerges when conditions allow. Intention functions within the human being in a way analogous to the conditions that allow crystals to form. Intention does not create reality from nothing, as simplistic versions of the law of attraction suggest. Rather, intention creates the internal conditions from which certain possibilities that already existed in the realm of potential can crystallize into the realm of reality. A clear, sustained intention, consistent with the emotional states of the person who holds it, is the internal equivalent of the temperature, stillness, and purity of the environment that allow a crystal to form with the greatest possible geometric perfection. The difference between an intention that crystallizes into a result and one that remains an undefined desire without materialization has less to do with the conscious willpower applied and more to do with the coherence between what is declared as intention at the conscious level and what the inner field is transmitting at the level of the fluids, the patterns of the autonomic nervous system, and the pain files that operate below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. An intention of prosperity declared from a field saturated with the frequency of fear of scarcity does not crystallize into prosperity. It crystallizes in the forms that the dominant frequency of the field determines, which are the forms of the fear underlying the declared intention. Therefore, the work of clarifying the inner field that this book has been developing is neither separable from nor prior to working with intention. It is simultaneous with it. Intention becomes progressively more coherent and more capable of crystallizing at the level of material reality as the field from which it emanates is purified of the archives of pain, hydrated with experiences of expansion and beauty, and aligned with the current of the being's genuine purpose. The most powerful intention is not necessarily the most energetic or the most elaborate in its formulation. It is the most coherent, the one supported by the greatest congruence between what is declared in consciousness and what the biological field transmits at its base frequency. The crystal of intention also forms in stillness, agitated insistence, desire born of urgency, and the fear of someone who feels that if they don't get what they want immediately, something terrible will happen, produces conditions equivalent to the sudden cooling of water, which generates amorphous ice instead of ordered crystals. Sovereign calm, the state of one who knows that what is aligned with their field will arrive in the appropriate time and form, creates the conditions for the most perfect crystallization. Choose a central intention for this period of your life. Formulate it as precisely as possible. Not what you want to avoid, but what you want to create. Then examine that intention from your body. When you hold it in your mind, what sensation does it generate in your body? Expansion or contraction? Heat or cold? Lightness or heaviness? The bodily sensations that accompany an intention will tell you more accurately than any intellectual analysis whether or not your inner field is in alignment with what you declare you want. Work daily this week to increase the alignment between your stated intention and the accompanying bodily state, using gratitude, silence, and any other practices from the previous chapters that you find helpful. What is the intention you have been declaring the longest without it crystallizing into reality? What dominant emotional frequency in your inner field might be incompatible with the crystallization of that intention? Chapter 23. Breaking the Ice. The liberation of rigid structures. Every healing process, sooner or later, encounters the most rigid structures of the inner field, those that are not merely patterns of tension or archives of pain, but true identity constructs that the individual has built over years or decades. While these structures may limit freedom and obstruct the flow of life, They serve to provide a sense of solidity and predictability, without which existence would seem too threatening to inhabit. These structures are the ice of the self, fixed, forms that the water of identity adopted at some point in response to conditions that made free movement too dangerous, and which have remained in that solid state far longer than those original conditions warranted. Rigid identity structures are recognized by their particular resistance to any questioning. They are not simply beliefs held firmly. They are truths that appear not to be beliefs at all, that appear to be merely the objective description of how things are and how one is. They are the "this is who I am" and "this is life" statements uttered not with the openness of someone sharing an observation, but with the closed-mindedness of someone proclaiming a natural law unavailable for discussion. In each of these absolute statements lies an icy structure that, if it could melt away, would release an enormous amount of energy for movement, creativity, and transformation. The process of breaking down the ice of identity cannot be forced from the outside without producing traumatic fractures. Ice broken by external impact does not become fluid water. It fragments into smaller but equally rigid pieces that can be equally limiting and are potentially more dangerous because their sharp edges produce new wounds. The genuine process of transforming ice into water requires heat, not impact. It requires the gradual raising of the field's temperature from within, a heat that comes from the direct experience that movement is safe, that fluidity is possible, that letting go of the fixed form does not mean falling into a structureless void, but rather accessing a more sophisticated level of dynamic organization that ice could not offer. The experiences that bring this liberating warmth are as varied as the types of rigid structures that exist. For some people, the warmth that melts the ice comes from a relationship that accepts them completely, including aspects that had been carefully hidden behind the rigid structure. For others, it comes from a creative practice that allows them to explore possibilities of expression that the fixed identity did not include. For still others, it comes from the gradual and voluntary exposure to situations that the rigid structure had always classified as too dangerous to consider, and from the progressive discovery that the feared danger was far smaller than the price being paid to avoid it. Melting ice doesn't disappear. It transforms. The energy trapped in maintaining rigidity is released into flow. And what emerges from the thawing is not a formless, unstructured being. It is a being whose structure is no longer rigid and immovable, but adaptable and responsive, capable of taking the form that each situation requires without losing the coherence of its deepest nature. Like water that adopts the shape of any container without ceasing to be water. Identify a rigid structure in your identity that you have been able to recognize through the work in previous chapters. It might be a belief about what you are capable of doing or receiving, a role you have assumed so completely that you no longer distinguish between the role and yourself, or a narrative about how life works that has guided your decisions without being questioned. This week, conduct a small experiment. Just once, act in a way that this structure would normally forbid. It doesn't have to be a huge gesture. It can be as small as expressing an opinion you would normally keep to yourself, asking for something you wouldn't normally ask for, or saying no where you would normally say yes. Observe what actually happens, not what the rigid structure predicted would happen. What version of yourself would be available if the rigid structure you've identified softened enough to cease being a limitation? What have you been paying in terms of vitality and freedom for maintaining that rigidity? Chapter 24. The Flow of Abundance. Healing the Relationship with Prosperity. the relationship that human beings have with prosperity and material abundance is, for most of us living in contemporary cultures, one of the areas most deeply contaminated by archives of pain, by contradictory beliefs, and by a particularly potent mix of desire and shame, making this field one of the most difficult to approach with honesty and clarity. Wounds related to money and abundance are rarely just economic wounds. More often than not, they are wounds of love, self-worth, belonging, and deservingness that have found their most visible expression in the material world. To understand why material abundance is a field of healing and not merely a field of financial strategy, it's necessary to observe how the water in your biology responds to thoughts and emotional states related to money and prosperity. For most people, thoughts about money immediately activate the body's threat system, producing the same biochemical cascades that occur with any perceived danger. This means that the brain of someone whose relationship with money is based on a fear of scarcity processes economic information not from the prefrontal cortex, the center of strategic planning and rational decision-making, but from the amygdala, the center of threat processing and emergency response. Economic decisions made from a state of heightened fear have predictable and consistent characteristics. They are short-term because the emergency system operates exclusively in the immediate present. They are reactive because the threat system responds to stimuli and does not generate initiatives. They are repetitive because the system tends to reproduce the responses that in the past produced the greatest immediate reduction of discomfort, regardless of whether those responses were strategically useful. And they are self-limiting because the fear of scarcity produces precisely the kind of contraction of the field that makes the reproduction of the conditions that generated the original fear more likely. Healing our relationship with abundance is therefore not primarily a matter of financial education, although financial education has its place in a comprehensive transformation process in this area. It is, fundamentally, a process of identifying and dissolving the painful memories that contaminate our inner field when we activate the realm of prosperity. It is the work of separating money from the wounds of love and self-worth with which it has become intertwined. It is the practice of developing the capacity to think, decide, and act in the economic sphere from a state of inner field that fosters strategic clarity and creative openness rather than fear and contraction. The flow of abundance naturally flows to those who receive it as their due, not in the sense of arrogant entitlement, but in the sense of the receptive openness of those who know that prosperity is not at odds with any genuine spiritual value, and that receiving it fully allows them to contribute more effectively to the well-being of those around them. Contracted, inner fields saturated with the fear of scarcity or the shame of wanting more restrict the flow in the same way that a clogged pipe restricts the flow of water. Not because the water is unavailable, but because the channel through which it should flow is too narrow to allow its passage. Perform this abundance field diagnostic exercise. Sit in silence and visualize receiving a significant amount of money, enough for the visualization to trigger real responses within your system. Observe carefully the bodily sensations that arise: expansion or contraction, warmth or cold, lightness or heaviness. Notice the automatic thoughts that appear. What are the first words or phrases that come to mind? Write down everything you observe without editing. This material is the map of your abundance field. The pain patterns that this map reveals are the working material for this chapter. What stories about money were passed down to you in your family of origin? What emotions dominated the family atmosphere when money was a topic of conversation, whether due to its presence or absence? How do those stories and emotions resonate within you today? Chapter 25. Baths of the Soul. The restorative power of deep rest. Ancient baths were not simply places where the body was washed. In the cultures that built and frequented them, they were sacred spaces of holistic restoration, places where the combination of heat, water, silence, and the community at rest created the conditions for a regeneration that went far beyond physical cleansing. They were places where human beings had explicit cultural permission to stop producing, to stop being useful in an instrumental sense, to stop fulfilling functions and roles, and simply to be, to soak, to release, to restore. The cultures that built these spaces intuitively knew something that modern medicine is documenting with increasing rigor: that deep restoration is not a luxury or a weakness. It is a biological need as fundamental as food. The culture of perpetual productivity that dominates the contemporary world has declared with the effectiveness of any ideology that manages to present itself as a simple description of reality, that rest is wasted time, that recovery is for the weak, that the person of value is the one who is always active, always producing, always moving toward the next goal. This narrative, presented with the authority of economic truism, has documented biological consequences that include the chronic exhaustion of the body's regulatory systems, the progressive degradation of the immune system's responsiveness, the disruption of sleep-wake cycles that are fundamental for consolidating learning and tissue repair, and the progressive loss of the ability to access states of creativity, intuition, and deep connection that only emerge when the nervous system has enough space to escape its constant state of emergency. The profound rest offered by the soul's thermal baths is not the rest of exhaustion, that involuntary collapse of the system that can no longer cope and simply shuts down until it recovers the bare minimum to resume production. It is the rest chosen from the sovereignty of one who understands that deep restoration does not interrupt the process of transformation and healing. It sustains it. It makes it possible. Without regular periods of deep restoration, the work of healing tends to become another kind of production, another task on the to-do list, carried out with the usual tension instead of with the openness and receptivity required to bear its deepest fruit. The thermal baths of each being's soul are different because the paths to deep restoration are different for each organism and each story. For some, the most restorative rest is deep, prolonged sleep, to which full access is rarely granted in cultures of the productive early morning. For others, it is literal contact with water, the long, mindful bath, meditative swimming, immersion in natural springs that replenishes something within the body that no other practice can in the same way. For others, it is gentle, aimless movement, a stroll without a destination, exploring space without the pressure to produce or arrive anywhere. For still others, it is prolonged aesthetic contemplation, allowing oneself to be in the presence of something beautiful for as long as necessary for beauty to do its work. What all these forms of deep rest share is the characteristic of returning the nervous system to a sustained parasympathetic state, not just for minutes, but for hours, creating windows of time during which the biological repair processes that require stillness and available resources can operate with the fullness they need. During these periods, the water in your body reorganizes, tissues regenerate, cellular memory integrates the work done during periods of activity, and the internal field accumulates the reserve of vitality from which the next cycle of activity and transformation can be sustained with the energy and presence it deserves. This week, design your personal thermal bath. Choose a block of time of at least 2 hours, free from commitments and responsibilities that might demand your attention, and dedicate it entirely to a form of rest that genuinely restores your inner field. Not entertainment that distracts, but doesn't restore. Choose that particular kind of stillness or gentle movement that, in your experience, leaves your inner field fuller at the end than at the beginning. Prepare the space with intention. Protect it with conviction from interruptions. And at the end, write in your journal the difference in your inner state between the beginning and end of those hours. This record will be your personal evidence of the value of deep restoration. When was the last time you granted yourself a truly deep period of rest without guilt? What internal or external narratives make rest feel like something that needs to be justified or earned before it's allowed? Chapter 26. The Swell of Relationships: Love, Boundaries, and Resonance. Human relationships are the arena where inner healing work is tested with the greatest rigor and honesty. Maintaining a highly coherent inner field is relatively easy during a solitary meditation practice in the silence of a protected space with only oneself present. The true level of integration of the work done is revealed the moment another human being enters the field, with their own history of wounds, their own frequencies and patterns, and the inevitable dance of mutual influences that constitutes any genuine relationship begins. It is in this contact that the archives of pain we thought we had dissolved show whether they truly dissolved or simply found a deeper refuge from which they continue to operate. Relationships function like waves on the surface of an inner ocean. The waves don't create the ocean's water. They reveal its state. An ocean with a highly coherent internal field responds to the waves with the elasticity and fluidity of one who can be moved without being swept away, who can receive the impact of the wave and return the movement in a way that doesn't reproduce chaos but transforms it. An ocean whose internal field is saturated with the frequencies of fear, mistrust, or unprocessed need responds to the same waves with the agitation of one who lacks the depth to absorb the movement, and whose surface becomes the stage for a storm that, in another state of the field, would simply be another wave. Genuine love, the kind spiritual traditions recognize as the highest frequency available for human experience, is not, in its deepest nature, an emotion that occurs between two people. It is a state of the inner field that makes true connection with another being possible. Love born from the fear of loneliness is not love, but attachment. Love born from the need to be completed by another is not love, but dependence. Love born from guilt or obligation is not love, but a contract. Genuine love arises from the field of one who has enough of themselves, enough contact with their own inner source, to be able to give without being emptied and to receive without being filled with what is foreign, to the point of losing touch with their own essence. The boundaries in relationships, as understood in this chapter, are not protective walls erected out of fear of being hurt again. They are the natural expression of self-knowledge, the articulation of where one's own field ends and the other's begins, not as absolute separation, but as the recognition that two beings can only genuinely connect when each remains sufficiently present in their own field to allow for a real encounter between two distinct presences, and not a fusion where both dissolve into a dynamic that neither can no longer call their own. The resonance between two internal fields is the most fascinating and least understood phenomenon of relational dynamics. Two beings are drawn to each other because their fields resonate, because the frequencies each emits find something in the other's field that recognizes them, something familiar that can be either the frequency of healing or the frequency of wounding. Relationships born from the resonance of wounding have an initial intensity that is often mistaken for deep love, because the activation they produce is real and powerful. But that intensity is the energy of the pain pattern that recognizes itself in the other and celebrates its reproduction with the same emotion with which any system celebrates its return to its familiar operating conditions. Relationships born from the resonance of healing possess a different quality, less dramatic at the outset, but more sustainable as they develop. There is a calm that is not a lack of depth, but a presence of security. There is an ease that is not superficiality, but an absence of the tension produced by the need to control or be controlled. There is a space within the bond that allows both beings to continue growing without the growth of one threatening the security of the other. And there is, in the most genuine moments of that relationship, the experience of what mystics of all traditions have attempted to describe: love as a state of recognizing one's own nature reflected in that of the other. Choose the most significant relationship in your current life and complete this resonance diagnostic exercise. In your notebook, divide a page into 2 columns. In the first column, write how your inner field typically feels in the presence of that person. The predominant emotions, recurring bodily sensations, and most frequent thoughts. In the second column, describe how you typically feel after spending time with that person. Fuller or emptier, more expanded or more contracted, closer to yourself or further away. This honest assessment will give you accurate information about the nature of the resonance that characterizes that relationship right now. In which relationship in your life do you consistently feel you give more than you receive? In which do you feel there is a genuine exchange that nourishes both of you? What does that difference reveal about the state of your inner field in each of those relationships? Chapter 27. Purification through truth. Living without masks. There is a type of contamination of the inner field that no meditation practice, no somatic work technique, and no therapeutic intervention can completely dissolve as long as the source of that contamination remains active. It is the contamination produced by living consistently in the gap between what one is and what one presents oneself to be, between what one feels and what one says one feels, between the values one proclaims and the principles from which one actually acts when no one is watching. This gap, which psychology calls cognitive dissonance, and which spiritual traditions have named in various ways, but always with the connotation of a kind of inner split that comes at a tremendous price, generates in the inner field a form of chronic, low-intensity stress that contaminates all other processes with the same persistence with which a small but constant leak gradually contaminates an entire reservoir of water. The mask is the most sophisticated mechanism of human social adaptation. All human beings who operate in complex social contexts wear masks to some degree, and this is not inherently pathological. The ability to modulate one's presentation according to the context, to not express every thought and feeling in every situation, is a necessary and even compassionate social skill. The problem is not the mask as contextual modulation. The problem is the mask as a permanent substitution of one's true identity, the process by which social presentation becomes so fixed and so disconnected from the inner self that the individual can no longer distinguish between who they are and who they present themselves to be. When a mask becomes a substitute identity, the inner world pays a specific and quantifiable price. Maintaining coherence between the mask and the environment requires constant vigilance that permanently consumes nervous system resources. A part of our attention is always monitoring others' perceptions, adjusting our presentation according to the signals we receive, and anticipating potential threats to our constructed image. This vigilance never stops, not even in moments of apparent relaxation, because the system has learned that a threat can come from any direction at any time. The result is chronic exhaustion of non-physical origin that no amount of rest can resolve, because the source of the exhaustion is not physical exertion, but the energetic cost of sustained inauthenticity. Purification by truth is the process of progressively reducing the gap between the mask and the self, not through acts of dramatic and indiscriminate exposure of everything one is in any context, regardless of its relevance, but through the consistent practice of appropriate honesty. Honesty that chooses contexts where genuine expression is possible and valuable and cultivates it intentionally. That practices saying what one thinks when one has something real to say. That refuses to express agreement when one feels disagreement. That neither inflates nor diminishes the presentation of oneself to suit the perceived expectations of others. Each act of appropriate honesty introduces a pulse of purification into the inner field. Not spectacularly, but consistently and cumulatively. Over time, the coherence between who one is and what one presents produces a state of being that has a quality those who experience it describe as lightness, like the relief of no longer carrying a weight. They were so accustomed to bearing that they no longer felt it as such, but as part of their own structure. Purification through truth inevitably begins with honesty with oneself. The capacity to be honest with others is directly limited by the capacity to be honest with oneself, to look without evasion or drama at what one truly feels, what one truly wants, what one truly fears, what one truly values. The first mask one wears is not the one shown to the world. It is the one worn before the mirror of one's own conscience. Dedicate this week to a practice of radical honesty with yourself. Each night, before going to sleep, answer this single question in your notebook. What didn't I say today that was true for me? Not what you should have said to someone in particular, but simply what was true in your inner experience that found no expression in any way during the day. There is no wrong answer. No answer is too small or too big. Only raw honesty with what was real within you during that day. After 7 days, observe what patterns emerge in these entries. With whom or in what context of your life do you wear the most elaborate mask? What do you think would happen if that person or that context knew something about what you hide behind that mask? How realistic is that prediction versus how much is it the fear of the system that wants to protect the mask? Chapter 28. The Delta of Dreams. From Vision to Manifestation. A delta is the geometric formation created by a river as it reaches its final destination and opens into the sea or lake that receives it. It is the place where the concentrated force of the current, which has traveled kilometers from its source in the mountains, is distributed into multiple smaller channels that carry the water, soil, and nutrients it transports to the receiving land, fertilizing it and creating new life forms at the interface between fresh and salt water. The delta is not the end of the river. It is its blossoming, the most expansive and generative form that water takes just before merging with something larger than itself. Vision. That impulse towards something that doesn't yet exist in material reality, but that the being can perceive clearly enough for its image to generate a real state of activation and direction, is the mountain from which the river of purpose flows. Manifestation, the process by which that vision gradually takes shape in the field of three-dimensional reality, is the river's journey from the mountain to the delta. And the delta, the point of blossoming, where the vision has spread into multiple forms of real and concrete life, is what occurs when the inner field of the being is sufficiently purified, aligned, and sustained to allow the river of purpose to effectively reach its destination. The most common mistake in the relationship between vision and manifestation is treating the vision as a destination to be reached through the application of sufficient force and strategy rather than as the source from which the natural movement of the aligned field should flow. This confusion, as old as human ambition and as modern as any goal-setting methodology one can find, produces the paradoxical phenomenon of people working with extraordinary intensity toward their dreams, yet feeling them slipping further away with each additional effort they invest. Effort without field alignment is like trying to force water upstream. It can be done with sufficient mechanical force, but the energy cost is disproportionate to the result, and the current always flows back down its natural gradient the moment the force ceases. The manifestation that flows from the aligned field has a quality of inevitability that those who have experienced it invariably describe with the same wonder. It's not that the result came effortlessly, but rather that the effort had such a clear direction and was so congruent with the inner field that it didn't feel like a struggle, but like the pleasure of swimming with the current. Obstacles arose, but they didn't produce the existential exhaustion they do when faced from a misaligned field. Synchronicities, those coincidences that are actually evidence that the inner field is emitting a frequency coherent enough for external reality to begin reorganizing itself accordingly, multiplied. From vision to manifestation, there is a bridge that can only be built from the inside out. That bridge is made of sufficient clarity of the field for the vision to be perceived without distortion, sufficient purity of the internal fluids for the intention to crystallize without the blockages of unprocessed pain, sufficient trust in the process for the action guided by the field to be executed without the paralysis of fear of failure, and sufficient humility to recognize that the path between vision and manifestation has its own timing, its own curves, and its own meanders that no human will, however powerful, can dictate to the river. Spend 20 minutes visualizing your most central vision with the highest level of sensory detail you can sustain. Consider not only what you see in that vision, but also what you feel in your body when you are in it. What sounds surround it? What smells? What temperature? Then, without leaving the state that this visualization generates, write in your notebook the first concrete and small step that is available to you today, this week, that moves the field 1 millimeter in the direction of that vision. Not the biggest or most impressive step, the truest and most available one. The distance of a river is covered one step at a time. When was the last time you acted in accordance with your deepest vision, without fear of failure or fear of others' opinions interfering with your action? What small step in that direction could you take today that wouldn't require the complete disappearance of fear, but only the decision to move forward despite it? Chapter 29. Fog and Clarity. Navigating uncertainty. Fog is one of the most fascinating states of water in its atmospheric form. It is the state in which water droplets are too small to fall as rain, but too numerous to be. Invisible like vapor, suspended in that threshold where form is not fully defined, and the outline of the visible world dissolves into gradations ranging from relatively clear to completely opaque, depending on how deeply one penetrates it. Fog is not the absence of water. It is water in its most ubiquitous and least defined state, present everywhere and nowhere in particular at the same time. Periods of profound uncertainty in human life have precisely this nature. They are not periods of absence of life or potential. They are periods where the outline of what is to come is not yet sufficiently defined to be clearly perceived, where possibilities are present everywhere and nowhere at once, where the being navigating through the fog feels the dampness on their skin, knows that something is there, but cannot see more than a few steps in any direction. Uncertainty is not emptiness. It is the fog before conditions change and the outline of the landscape becomes visible again. Contemporary culture has a profoundly hostile relationship with uncertainty. The human nervous system, designed by evolution to detect patterns and predict danger, experiences uncertainty as a form of diffuse threat that activates the same alarm system as concrete dangers, with the difference that this alarm system has no specific object to act upon, no defined danger to confront or flee from. The result is the state of activation without discharge that characterizes anxiety, the energy of fear with nowhere to go. The ability to navigate uncertainty without being paralyzed by it is one of the most valuable skills the healing process develops, and also one of the most difficult to cultivate because it goes against some of the nervous system's most deeply ingrained response patterns. It isn't developed through positive thinking that denies the discomfort of the fog. It's developed through the gradual and consistent practice of remaining functionally present in states of not knowing, of learning to tolerate the tension between the desire for immediate clarity and the reality that clarity isn't yet available, without prematurely collapsing that tension by choosing any false certainty just to alleviate the discomfort of the fog. Those who have developed the capacity to inhabit uncertainty with presence and ease discover something that those who flee from it can never experience. That in the fog, if one remains still long enough and sharpens the available senses, signs emerge that the rush to resolve the uncertainty would have ignored. Intuition operates more clearly in the fog than in the noisy certainty of periods of absolute clarity, precisely because the absence of defined contours forces the perceptual field to operate with a broader and finer sensitivity. People who navigate uncertainty well are not those who are least afraid of the unknown. They are those who have learned to work with it instead of against it. The fog always clears, not because someone forces it to disappear through a sufficiently titanic effort of will, but because the conditions that generated it change with time and with the movement of the systems that produced it. The being who has learned to navigate the fog without losing touch with their inner world, without being swept away by the urgency of premature resolution, emerges on the other side of each period of uncertainty with a deeper understanding of the territory they have just traversed, and with greater confidence in their own ability to navigate the next fog when it arrives. If you are currently going through a period of significant uncertainty, use this practice. Sit in silence for 10 minutes with the fog of that uncertainty fully present, without trying to resolve it or escape it. Simply allow the not knowing to be there. Observe the bodily sensations it generates. Observe the thoughts that arise. And then ask yourself, from the deepest stillness you can achieve, without the urgency to resolve this uncertainty, what do I know right now about the right direction for me? What sign is emerging that the urgency of resolution would be silencing? Write down whatever comes without filtering. What has been your usual strategy in the face of uncertainty? Have you fled to any available certainty, even if it's not the right one? Frozen until the fog clears on its own, or learned to move slowly within it? What has that usual strategy cost you in life? Chapter 30. The Generational Glacier, Healing Inherited Wounds. There is a type of wound that didn't begin in your own story. It wasn't inflicted in your childhood by events that occurred within the confines of your personal life, although its impact is experienced with the same intimacy and intensity as the most directly personal wounds. It is the wound that came before you, carried in the energy field and behavioral patterns of the generations that preceded you, embedded in your biology through the mechanisms of epigenetics and the transgenerational transmission of trauma. It is as real and operative in your field as any direct experience in your own life, but with an additional layer of opacity that makes it more difficult to identify precisely because it lacks an associated personal memory to which it can be attributed. The metaphor of the glacier is precisely appropriate for this type of wound because it captures both its magnitude and its slow dynamism. A glacier is an accumulation of water in a solid state that has formed over centuries through the compression of successive layers of snow, each of which contains in its chemical and isotopic composition the information of the climate, the atmosphere, and the events of the moment it fell. The glacier is, literally, a memory of time stratified in ice. And that ice moves not with the speed of a river, but with the slowness of geology. But it moves, and its movement sculpts the landscape it traverses in ways that determine the shape of valleys, rivers, and coastlines far below its current position. Inherited wounds work exactly like this. They are the layered accumulation of unprocessed traumas from previous generations that traveled forward in time through the behavioral patterns those generations passed on to their children, through the family narratives that were told and unspoken with equal eloquence, and through the epigenetic mechanisms that molecular biology is documenting with ever-increasing precision. The possibility that experiences of extreme stress in one generation produce modifications in gene expression that are passed on to subsequent generations without any alteration to the genetic code itself. A person who carries inherited wounds often experiences suffering that cannot be fully explained based on their own personal history. There are emotional responses of disproportionate intensity to the stimuli that trigger them. There are fears whose origin cannot be traced to any event in their own life. There are patterns of relating or limiting that repeat themselves with a consistency that transcends what their own personal history can justify. And there is, frequently, the confusing feeling of carrying something that is not entirely their own, of suffering for something that did not happen to them directly, but that somehow belongs to them as well. Healing inherited wounds requires an act that is part archaeological and part ceremonial. The act of recognizing that the wound existed before you, that it belonged to those who came before you, that it has its own history, distinct yet inseparable from yours, and that you have both the capacity and the responsibility to be the generation where that pattern stops. Not because you are guilty of the suffering borne by those who came before you, but because you have something they did not. The awareness that the pattern exists and the tools to work with it so that it does not continue to travel forward. This act of halting the flow of the generational glacier is one of the most far-reaching acts of healing that a being can perform. Its effects are not limited to one's own life. They extend to future generations, to the children, nephews, or young people who orbit the healing being's field and who will grow up under the influence of a field that no longer transmits that particular frequency of inherited wound, but rather the frequency of a completed cycle and a transformed pattern. Sit in silence and bring to your awareness 3 generations of your family: your grandparents, your parents, and yourself. Without judging anyone, observe as honestly as possible what pattern of pain or limitation you can trace in those 3 generations. What kind of fear, what kind of relationship with love with money, with self-worth, or with authentic expression is repeated with variations across those generations. Write what you observe in your notebook. Then write these words, addressed to the previous generations, with as much authenticity as possible. I acknowledge what they carried. I honor their suffering. And I choose for this pattern to end here, in me, so that what comes next can be different. What would you be passing on to future generations if you don't consciously work through the inherited wounds you've identified? What kind of different legacy do you want to build with the work you're doing in this process? Chapter 31. The Tide of Intuition. Learning to listen without words. Tides are one of the most powerful and regular phenomena on Earth. Produced by the gravitational interaction between the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun, they represent the movement of enormous masses of water that rise and fall with a predictability that navigators throughout history have used as both a compass and a calendar. Tides cannot be fully observed from any point on the coast. They reveal themselves in changes in water level, in the appearance and disappearance of coastal rocks, and in the movement of ships moored in the harbor. They are invisible in themselves, but completely evident in their effects. Intuition operates with that same ebb and flow. It is a form of knowledge that cannot be directly observed, that does not operate through the usual channels of logical reasoning and the sequential accumulation of evidence. It reveals itself in its effects, in the sudden certainty that emerges without a preceding chain of reasoning, in the visceral discomfort with a situation that intellectual analysis would classify as certain, in the attraction toward a direction that cannot be justified with arguments that would satisfy the rational interlocutor. Intuition is the knowledge that the inner field has accumulated through pathways that transcend ordinary consciousness, processing information that the senses captured, but that the filter of conscious attention did not prioritize, integrating patterns that the analytical brain has not had the opportunity to explicitly process. Contemporary human beings have an enormously complicated relationship with their intuition. On the one hand, almost everyone reports having experienced it at some point, with enough clarity to recognize it when it arises. On the other hand, the culture of analytical thinking has generated a hierarchy of knowledge in which intuition occupies the lowest rung of credibility, reserved for the superstitions of the uneducated and the emotional whims of the irrational. This hierarchy has its consequences. Those who have fully internalized it spend years, sometimes decades, systematically ignoring a source of information that could have guided them more accurately than many of the rational analyses they privileged instead. Intuition is not infallible. It is a source of information that, like all sources, requires discernment in its interpretation. The difference between genuine intuition and fear disguised as intuition, between the guidance of a coherent field and the bias of a traumatized nervous system that imbues any signal remotely resembling past threats with urgency, is a distinction that only develops with practice and the honesty of someone willing to examine their own misinterpretations without using them as an excuse to dismiss it entirely. Learning to listen to intuition is fundamentally a process of gradually silencing the noise that obscures it. When the inner field is saturated with the noise of chronic fear, self-critical narratives, constant urgency, and the incessant dialogue of analytical thinking, the tidal signal of intuition simply cannot be perceived. It's like trying to hear a whisper in a crowd. The whisper exists, but the conditions don't allow for its reception. The practice of silence, the purification of the field from toxic sources, working with the archives of pain that generate the background noise. All of this not only heals in itself, but also gradually clears the medium of reception, so that the signal of the deepest intelligence of the self, can finally be heard with the clarity it deserves. For the next 7 days, carry a small notebook specifically to record any intuitive signs that arise. Each time you experience a sense of certainty without prior reasoning, a visceral discomfort with a situation that intellectual analysis cannot justify, or an attraction to something without an articulated reason, record it immediately along with the date and context. Do not analyze at the time of recording. Just document. At the end of the 7 days, review the record and see how many of those signs, in retrospect, pointed towards something that the week has confirmed as true or relevant. Are there any recurring intuitive signs in your life that you've been systematically ignoring because you couldn't rationally justify them? What has this silencing of intuition cost you in terms of the decisions you made in its absence? Chapter 32. Confluence. The integration of the fragments of being. A confluence is the point where two or more streams of water meet and merge into a single, larger body of water. It is a point of geographical transformation. The territory that existed before the confluence gives way to a different, larger territory with a greater flow and its own distinct character, which is not simply the sum of the streams that form it, but something new that emerges from their union. The great river confluences of the world are places of enormous fertility, ecological richness, and historical importance, precisely because in them life, in its most diverse and abundant forms, finds the conditions it needs to thrive. Throughout life, human beings become fragmented, not metaphorically, but functionally and literally. When faced with experiences that exceed their capacity for integration, the nervous system executes the same emergency protocol we have been describing throughout this book. However, in this case, the effect is not merely the storage of a record of pain, but the dissociation of a part of the inner field, the withdrawal of a portion of the self from ordinary consciousness to protect the whole from the impact of what that part experienced. Over time, and with the repetition of this process, the inner field can come to house multiple fragments of the self that operate relatively independently of one another, each with its own logic, its own needs, and its own automatic responses to the stimuli that activate them. This fragmentation is not a pathology in the sense of a moral or spiritual failing. It is the result of the organism's adaptive intelligence in the face of conditions that, at the time, exceeded its available capacity for integration. But fragmentation has operational costs that accumulate over time. The energy consumed in keeping the fragments of the self separate is energy that is not available for a creative and fulfilling life. The internal conflicts that emerge when different fragments of the self desire incompatible things generate a paralysis of action that from the outside is observed as inconsistency or a lack of will, but which, from within, is experienced as the genuine impossibility of moving when equal parts of the self point in opposite directions. The integration of the fragments of being is the process of creating the conditions for the different internal currents of the field to converge, expanding the total flow available for life. It is not a process of eliminating parts perceived as problematic, nor of subordinating the most vulnerable or wounded parts to the more functional and socially acceptable ones. It is a process of recognition, internal dialogue, and the gradual building of sufficient trust so that currents that have been running separately can begin to flow in the same channel without any of them losing what is essential to the process. Each integrated fragment releases energy. Each part of the self that ceases to consume resources, maintaining its separation and joins the main current of the field, brings something that was missing: the capacities, perspectives, vitality, and information that this fragment carried within it, and that ordinary consciousness could not access while it remained dissociated. The progressive integration of the fragments is the process by which the self becomes more complete, not in the sense of perfection, but in the sense of wholeness. Less and less divided against itself, more and more capable of moving its resources in the same direction. More and more like the river that has united all its streams into a single flow of purpose and integrated vitality. Identify two parts of yourself that are frequently in conflict, two inner voices that want incompatible things or have opposing views on the same situation. In your notebook, give voice to each one separately. First, write from the perspective of the first part. What does it want? What does it fear? What does it need? Then, write from the perspective of the second part, asking the same questions. Finally, seek a third perspective, that of the larger self that encompasses both, one that can see what each part needs without taking sides. What understanding emerges from this larger perspective that neither of the two parts could see separately? What part of yourself have you been rejecting, minimizing, or trying to eliminate because you perceive it as problematic or incompatible with who you want to be? What could that part offer you if, instead of rejecting it, you tried to understand what it needs and what it entails? Chapter 33: The Living Water of Creativity. Healing through expression. There is a realm of healing that purely cognitive and purely somatic approaches can rarely reach on their own with the same depth and speed as when combined with the power of creative expression. It is the realm of what cannot be fully expressed in direct words, of what the nervous system holds in formats that transcend propositional language, of the deepest layers of experience that only find their way to awareness and integration when offered the non-linear and non-rational space of creation. The living water of creativity is that which emerges not from the ambition to produce something that others will judge as beautiful or valuable, but from the inner need to give form to what exists within, as matter seeking its expression. This distinction is fundamental because creativity in service of external recognition, while it may produce works of great value to the recipient, rarely produces the kind of profound healing that creativity in service of inner truth brings. The former operates from the fear of not being enough. The latter operates from the urgency of being completely real. Human beings are expressive beings by nature. Before articulate language existed, our ancestors left handprints on cave walls, carved figures in bone and stone, and painted scenes from their lives with earth pigments. This need to externalize inner experience, to give it form in the material world, was not a cultural luxury. It was, and still is, a deep biological necessity. The organism's sensory and emotional systems do not merely register experience. They seek to complete the cycle by giving it a form that can be separated from the body and contemplated from the outside. This process of externalization and contemplation is itself a form of integration that internal movement alone, without external form, cannot fully achieve. Free writing, without the pressure of producing a coherent or literary text, is perhaps the most accessible creative tool for the healing process. Writing without a filter, without editing, letting words emerge from the body rather than the intellect, is a process that often surprises those who practice it with the precision with which it captures what the most elaborate attempts at articulation fail to name. Spontaneous drawing, dancing without an audience, singing without a pre-established melody, sculpting with basic materials. All these forms of expression share the capacity to create the external space, where the internal experience can be deposited and contemplated with a distance that makes it more manageable and more understandable. Creativity as a healing practice doesn't require artistic talent. It requires the courage to express oneself without judgment, to allow what exists within to find its form in the material world without being filtered through the lens of whether it's good enough, right enough, or presentable enough to be shown. The process is the healing. The product is secondary and may never be shared with anyone. What matters is that the energy trapped within has found its way out, and that the cycle of expression, perhaps interrupted by decades of cultural silencing or fear of judgment, has been completed. This week, dedicate 30 minutes to a completely free creative expression practice, with no goal of producing anything of value to anyone other than yourself in this process. It can be automatic writing, spontaneous drawing, improvised movement, or any other form of expression that feels closest to the temperature of what you're carrying in your inner field right now. The only rule is not to stop and judge what emerges. Allow it to flow for the full 30 minutes. When you finish, observe the state of your inner field before and after the exercise. Write down a single word that describes the difference. What forms of creative expression did you practice in childhood that you later abandoned? What did that abandonment cost your healing process? What could be recovered if you return to any of those forms from the freedom of an adult who no longer needs anyone's approval to create? Chapter 34, The Inner Tempest, Transforming Anger into Power. Anger is the emotion that has been most systematically misunderstood, mismanaged, and misrepresented in the spiritual and psychological narratives circulating in contemporary personal development circles. Too often, it is presented as the opposite of love, as evidence of a lack of spiritual evolution, as a sign that something is fundamentally wrong with the person experiencing it, as an emotion that the truly mature and spiritually advanced will have transcended forever. This portrayal, while well-intentioned in its desire to promote peace and compassion, produces one of the most consistent harms to the healing process: the suppression of an emotion that has a legitimate and irreplaceable biological and existential function. Anger is the guardian of boundaries. It is the body's signal that something has crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed, that a legitimate need is not being met, that one's own integrity or that of a loved one is being threatened. In its primary biological form, anger is responsive energy, the mobilization of the body's resources to confront a transgression. It is activation without the hopelessness of fear and without the collapse of pain. It is the capacity of the individual to say no with the same power with which they say yes. Systematically, suppressing this signal, teaching children from a young age that anger is unacceptable regardless of the context that produces it, does not create more loving and peaceful beings. It creates beings with atrophied boundaries and an accumulation of unprocessed anger that eventually manifests in the most inappropriate ways possible, or turns inward as self-criticism and depression. The inner tempest of unprocessed anger is one of the most frequent and least acknowledged sources of pain. Many people who present themselves as calm and non-confrontational carry beneath that surface a quantity of anger accumulated over decades, which occasionally seeps out in ways that surprise and embarrass them. The disproportionate outburst in response to a minor stimulus, sarcasm that cuts deeper than intended, aggressive passivity that indirectly expresses what direct anger is not allowed to say, chronic illness that stores in the body what anger has been unable to express in behavior. Transforming anger into power doesn't mean turning it into aggression. It means learning to work with its energy in a way that serves clarity and direct action, rather than allowing it to build up like poison or manifest as destruction. Anger that has found its appropriate form of expression and action becomes the energy that sets boundaries clearly and unapologetically, that propels movement toward change in unacceptable situations, and that protects what needs protecting with the effectiveness of someone acting from emotional clarity rather than accumulated resentment. The first step in working with anger is the same as with all the emotions we've been exploring in this book: allowing yourself to acknowledge it, to feel it fully in your body without acting impulsively. Anger that is fully felt, that is allowed to be fully present in the body, generally has a much shorter, natural duration than anger that is suppressed and therefore remains trapped indefinitely. Anger that flows completes its cycle. Anger that is suppressed becomes resentment, which is solidified anger. Anger that has lost its ability to move and therefore can no longer fulfill the function of signal and impulse it had in its fluid form. Identify a past or present situation that triggers an angry response in you, preferably one you've been avoiding fully acknowledging. Create the necessary conditions of privacy and safety. Then allow the anger to be fully present in your body, noticing its temperature, its location, its impulse to move. If you need to express it physically, use a cushion or pillow to physically externalize the energy without directing it toward any person or property. When the energy of anger has found its expression, remain silent and observe what emerges after the storm. Often, what emerges is the gentler emotion that the anger was protecting, the pain, fear, or need for love that lay beneath it, waiting to be acknowledged. To whom or what in your past do you harbor anger that has not yet found its appropriate form of expression and transformation? What legitimate need of yours was that original anger pointing to that was not met? Chapter 35. The Eternal Spring. The Fountain that Never Runs Dry. We have reached the final chapter of this book, and yet we have not reached the end of the process it describes. This distinction is deliberate and fundamental. A book has pages, and pages eventually run out. The process of healing from the source does not have a point of arrival after which the work is completely finished, and the being can settle permanently into a state of fullness without any need to continue cultivating what it has built. The eternal spring is not a destination to be reached. It is a relationship that deepens, a practice that becomes progressively more natural and more integrated into the fabric of daily life, until it is no longer experienced as a practice separate from life, but as the very way of being alive. The eternal spring is the most accurate image available to describe the inner source of healing, vitality, and renewal that every human being carries within, regardless of their history, their wounds, or the magnitude of the work still ahead. It is not a metaphor for something that exists in some ethereal realm beyond the reach of direct experience. It is a description of a state of the inner field that is accessible to any being willing to undertake the work of connecting with it. The work that this book has been describing chapter by chapter. The inexhaustible source is not the absence of difficulty. It is not the inner field that is never disturbed again, that never again experiences pain, fear, or confusion. It is the inner field that has developed sufficient depth, sufficient elasticity, and sufficient contact with its own fluid nature, so that disturbances, when they arrive, and they will, are processed for what they are: information, temporary movement within the field, waves that cross the ocean without altering its depths. The being who has found contact with the eternal spring is not immune to suffering. They are able to traverse it with the presence of one who knows that suffering passes, and that on the other side, there is always more life, more depth, and more capacity for love than before. Throughout the previous 36 chapters, you have been invited to explore your fluid nature, to identify and begin dissolving the files of pain that were polluting your field, to develop the capacity to be present with your own inner experience with honesty and compassion, to cultivate practices that nurture the coherence of your nervous system and the clarity of your field, to heal inherited wounds, to find the current of your genuine purpose, and to expand the reach of your field into service to others. Each of these chapters has been a step inward toward the source that has always been there, waiting to be found. Continuing this process doesn't require any special tools you haven't already found in these pages. It requires consistent practice of what you already know, the willingness to apply it when it's most needed and when you resist it most, patience with the process's own rhythm, which doesn't always match the pace the ego would prefer for its transformation, and enough faith in the nature of water to know that a sustained flow in the right direction will eventually reach where it needs to go. The eternal spring is not at the end of the road. It is on the road itself. In every moment of genuine presence with one's own experience, in every practice undertaken not with the urgency to produce a result, but with the openness of one who is learning the language of the inner field. In every decision to choose fluidity over rigidity when fear pushes toward freezing. In every act of honesty that reduces the gap between the mask and the self. In every exercise of self-compassion that dissolves a little more the narrative of inadequacy that the world installed before you had the capacity to question it. Each time you return to the practices in this book, each time you remember in the midst of difficulty that you are fluid and not solid. Each time you choose to work with your inner field instead of continuing to push against the surface of external reality in the hope that something will change without the inner self. Changing first, you are drinking from the spring, and the spring responds to those who drink from it with the only answer that water knows how to give: more water, more life, more capacity to flow into territories that the rigidity of fear had declared inaccessible. The ocean of your being has no known bottom, and its surface, which you have been purifying with the work in this book, now reflects more clearly the light that was always available to be reflected. The journey doesn't end here. It begins here, but differently than it did in the first few pages. It began with the question of how to heal. It continues with the understanding that healing isn't about reaching a final state, but about inhabiting the process of being alive, fluid, present, and moving ever more fully and consciously in the direction of one's own source. The spring is eternal because the source that feeds it isn't subject to the same limitations as the transient states of the water that surrounds it. It is the deepest nature of being, prior to all wounds and subsequent to all healings, the pure water that always was and always will be, the foundation of who you are. Let the flow continue. Let the source continue to find its way through you to the world that needs what only you, from your unique and unrepeatable healing process, can offer. The closing of this book is also an opening. Write a letter in your notebook to yourself, to the being who began this book in the first chapter. Tell them what you have discovered about your fluid nature, about the archives you have begun to dissolve, about the practices that have produced the most real changes in your field. Then write a second letter to the being you will be in a year's time if you continue cultivating what this process has begun. Tell that future self what you know now about the wellspring within you. Keep these letters and open them in 12 months. What has changed in the way you perceive yourself from the first pages of this book to this final chapter. What is the first thing you will do differently tomorrow morning as a result of what you have explored in this process? What promise will you make to the wellspring within you about how you will continue to cultivate this relationship with your own source? Before we say goodbye, I want to remind you that the first link to explore this topic in much greater depth is in the description. Don't just settle for knowing a little more. Invest in yourself, follow your curiosity, and discover everything you're capable of achieving. See you soon.